Coincidentally, I was doing some fairly intense pandemic gaming in December, January. Not this pandemic, though. It was African swine fever, which is far worse if you're a pig. So it led to directly or indirectly to deaths of a quarter of the world's pigs in the last year. And I've also worked with UN humanitarian agencies and educational gaming, in which epidemic disease was part of the broader set of issues that we were dealing with.
So we have another question. Do you see much A/B testing of policy through games? And do you suppose this can mitigate some of the poor modeling or poor data problems?
I don't see much of it. I think it can be very useful. Oddly, in my experience, when clients have said, I want a game to look at this, and I've said, you should do A/B testing, you should run multiple games looking at different policies and evaluating them, there's often been resistance, partly because the client wants a game to validate what it is they've already decided to do. And interestingly, in one game design where we very systematically did A/B testing, it turned out that B was better than A, and the client preferred A, and so the results of the war game didn't get the publicity they otherwise would have gotten, precisely because the game did not support the predilections of the sponsor. So absolutely, I think we have to be very careful about single games around issues because of the idiosyncrasy problem. It is, of course, very hard to run multiple games, both in terms of times and money, and also because you rarely can do it with the same lot of participants. There's either learning from game one to game two, which is problematic, or they don't have the time. And so you run the methodological problem that can you legitimately compare the A games and B games when they had different participants in them.
You also made a comment that wargaming of pandemics needs to be more systematic and needs to have better data collection capabilities for post-processing results. How do you make sure you don't create or run a simulation versus an interactive game?
Well, I mean, I think what makes a game is the ability to make interesting and relevant choices. You don't want it simply to be scripted or to be automated, and the players are not facing the choices of what they do. That's where games deliver, is exploring choices, why those choices get made, and some of the consequences of those choices. I don't think we have, I mean, we have the data that we have with regard to COVID-19. The data is getting better, but the data is still partial. We have the models that we have. The models are okay. Even those involved in the epidemiological models would recognize that there are some limitations to them. I think what's important is to be clear about where there are methodological and data and modeling gaps, and not black box them. That is to say, not to sort of wish away the potential problems that they have. And I think, in fact, the game can be quite a useful way of identifying problems with models as well. So one of the value of the game is not just the game output in terms of what the decisions were made, but the participants reflecting on existing modeling and existing data, and how it might be wrong, or how it might be flawed, or how it might need to be enriched.
So can you give an example of a time when you actively suggested gaming as a method, and why?
We used a series of game-like methods in conjunction with what's now Global Affairs Canada, Department of Foreign Affairs in Canada, the US State Department, the European Union, and the FCO, in support of the Middle East peace process at various times, usually to elicit ideas on negotiation, or even negotiation language in some cases, or to stress test things that were being considered as elements of the peace process. This was back in the days when we actually had a peace process, not the current era. And those were quite useful at forcing experts to actually commit themselves to models and language and modalities, as opposed to speaking in general terms, which was a problem we were having with BogSats, with people just sitting around a table, was the tendency of us academics to like to pontificate, but not actually get very detailed in terms of things like language, or things like implementation models. So I thought that was all very useful. Now, the Middle East peace process turned out to be a disastrous failure. So perhaps I shouldn't be claiming any credit for having used gaming in support of it.
So do you have a view on the level of evidence generated through wargaming? And I think by level, I think what is meant is quality. So specifically in a crisis, there's a need for rapid analysis, a rapid turnaround of outcomes to inform policy. So is there an acceptance for insights that are just good enough?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, the perfect can be the enemy of the good, and I think that's why we shouldn't be reluctant to be frank about some of the limitations. I think we should make those trade-offs up front. We can do this for you quickly, but there are problems. I spent yesterday doing stuff in government, as it were. In particular requests to COVID-19 emergency gaming, and in some cases, yeah, I mean, our conclusions were we could usefully game this. Here's what you'd get out of it. Here's what you'd not get out of it. And we were really using the gaming as a mechanism to force people to think through the limitations of their plans and what could go wrong. So it was really a different method to force participants to think through the problems they might have, as opposed to just simply rehearsal of concept where everyone talks through what it is they plan to do, but there's no real mechanism to force them to identify what could go wrong and how it would go wrong and how they would deal with that contingency.
So would you say that a matrix game is the default format as a starting point for Paul Mill games?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I use matrix games a lot. They're quick to develop. They produce arguments over causality. They generate data. The African swine fever game that Agriculture Canada has run a bunch of. They've been an absolute model in terms of governmental gaming. That was a matrix game. However, seminar games have a value, and you can mix them. I have a couple of times run mixed seminar matrix games, which switches back and forth between the two formats. So you get the value of a bunch of people discussing the course of action in a seminar game type format, and then you play through some of that in a matrix game, and then you go back to a seminar game. Every problem has a different version of a gaming tool that might help it. So I would always avoid being overly committed to one particular gaming approach.
And at King's, we actually haven't used matrix games to look at Paul Mill problems, and we've used a range of different approaches, but we found that matrix games weren't well tailored to best understand escalation and nuclear risks, and I can talk more about that later on. So the next question is, can you share a few examples where gaming has specifically helped shape policy responses during a pandemic? Or
no, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. That's because pandemic gaming is not my primary thing. If you ask me that question in a few months, the answer might be yes, because I'm doing some current gaming stuff. I certainly do know of cases where gaming of pandemic issues in advance of the pandemic has caused people to rethink issues. Again, I have to be careful how much I talk about certain things, but the gaming on African swine fever, for example, it was interesting that within the same agency, the game provided an opportunity for people to hear different perspectives from within their own agency, which caused them to slightly reassess some of their policy perspective, simply because the game provided a forum for interaction amongst in-house subject matter experts who are otherwise sitting in different parts of the building working on different aspects of the problem.
So a lot of gaming is about adversarial interaction. So how do you best team a pandemic scenario?
I'm not sure there's a best way, because it depends on what you're trying to do. You know, it is possible to make the virus a player, and not that it actually anticipates, but have someone trying to think where the gaps are in your pandemic response, almost playing a devil's advocate role. That's a possibility. In terms of other kinds of red teaming, what is your red team? Is it the public reaction? Is it the reaction of markets? It rather depends on on who you are. Do your participants red team themselves? I think it depends a lot on who your participant group is, what aspect of the pandemic you're trying to examine, how much time you have, how many people you have. I'm not sure that there's a single best way to red team anything, including a pandemic.
So how do you think war games can help educate the public and prevent unwanted behavior? Like, for example, we've recently seen issues with panic buying.
I mean, there are already a bunch of educational sort of browser-based and other games out there which are intended to educate the public about, physical distancing, hand washing, and so on and so forth. They're a bit lectury. They're a bit, can you do all this in order to win the game? And it's the very obvious things we're all being told to do. They probably work well with kids. I'm not sure they work so well with adults. They're very simple gauges. I'm not sure that a game is the way I would do that. Probably more education around the fact that there is enough toilet paper in the universe. No one is going to be using more toilet paper, and if you're just patient and buy toilet paper at the normal rate, there won't be a shortage of toilet paper. I'm not sure I would use a game to communicate that message. I think a witty social media campaign would probably be far more engaging with a clever video that gets shared than doing that in a game. And that's a good example of something where you could do it as a game, but why do it as a game when there are other ways of doing it?
And at this point, I would like to turn to some of our other panelists, if you'd like to join in as part of the discussion.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm sorry, my internet connection has been getting a little bit, yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, my apologies. My name is Denis Balčitis. I am a research coordinator with Brussels-based Emerging Threat Assessment Project. We are an association of young researchers or lobbyists, people working in different industries. Essentially, one of the things that we are interested in is wargaming as well. So, I just wanted to thank Professor Brynan for a very interesting presentation, and just ask also, I think it has been partially addressed, but indeed, where is that fine line between wargaming? Is it better indeed to wargame before a crisis hits? Or in your opinion, is it better to start wargaming once you have some, so to say, initial data? You already know what is the challenge at hand, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Oh, I think it's enormously useful to wargame before you run into a crisis. I mean, I think wargaming really comes into its own there in forcing people to think, are you prepared for this? Do your contingency plans allow for this? What could go wrong? What are the requirements of doing what you might want to do? You have to understand that that never is the scenario that you wargame in advance going to turn out to be your crisis scenario. But I do think, nonetheless, it's extraordinarily useful. During a crisis, I mean, obviously, we saw wargaming during World War II. Famously, the Western Approach's tactical unit was wargaming U-boats versus convoys in the middle of the battle and providing insight back in real time as Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy escorts were battling German submarines. So that's what better example can there be of gaming during a crisis? But those were clearly delineated questions in which the stakeholders wanted answers, and there was a system for producing the answer and disseminating it. So gaming during a crisis can be very useful. Nothing in my presentation should be taken as suggesting that we should stop gaming during a crisis, and I spent most of yesterday doing serious stuff about gaming during the crisis. It's just I think we need to ask ourselves some questions before we game, and sometimes the answer to the question should be, you don't need a game for that, or we don't have time for a game for that, or I can't put together a game of sufficient quality in time, or we can't get all those people to spend 3 hours together because they have other things to do. Sometimes that should be the correct answer to a game request. It shouldn't always be, okay, yeah, sure, I'd love to run a game on that.
So do some of the other panelists wish to join the discussion with a comment? And in the meantime, we have another question on how do we use the virus as background context to wargame to see if it influences broader decision-making?
That's a really interesting question. And if we're looking at how the virus might affect other things in the longer term, so for example, what are the implications of the virus for regional conflict, or what are the implications of the virus for U.S., Chinese geostrategic things moving forward, there you have a little less concern about accidentally contributing to panic because those are sort of broader long-term issues. They're not the ones that the public is preoccupied right now. We have a big problem that we don't know how it all will work out, but I do think that fairly soon we're going to be in a position to think about, okay, how has the virus modified our thoughts about regional or international security or foreign policy issues? How does it modify how we might approach development assistance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I think it's going to be an interesting question about how much we go back in 2 years, 18 months, 2 years, whatever, to business as usual, or the extent to which this situation, possibly ongoing epidemics of COVID-19 in parts of the world, how that affects what we do.
Ben Williams, you'd like to join? Can you turn your audio on, please?
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so Ben Williams, I'm professor of finance in Clermont-Ferrand, French University. So I have a question. So thank you so much for this great presentation, and I'm also a regular reader of the excellent PACSIMS website. So it's a great opportunity. So I have a question, because traditionally on a theater of conflict, you have two parties. You have the blue against the reds. But we used to say these days that the virus is a kind of invisible enemy. And I would like to have your opinion on how to model and how to introduce the virus in the game. So my question is the virus played by the empire, introduced by the scenario, or would it be possible to introduce the virus as a third party and as a player in the game?
I think it's possible to do that. When we were gaming African swine fever with Agriculture Canada, and African swine fever is 3 times more infectious than COVID-19 and has a 95% fatality rate if you're a pig, and hangs around on surfaces longer. So if you're a pig, it's many times worse than COVID-19, which is why agriculture ministries are so worried about it. There we started with the virus as a player, and we abandoned that because we found it was getting a bit too gamey. That is to say that what the virus was doing was not necessarily always the way the virus would actually behave. People had a little trouble separating themselves as a player from the modeling of epidemic. What we ended up doing is essentially building the virus pandemic into the events deck. So for each turn, you drew a card, and that card was how logically an epidemic would progress. The effectiveness of that card, what that card actually did, would be moderated by decisions that had already been made in the game. But in a sense, we had a scripted pandemic. Players didn't know what was coming up, and they were trying to anticipate what was a scripted pandemic, and we would modify the pandemic depending on what they did. We did, however, have a player in that particular game called Markets and Mishaps, which was not the virus, but was how would consumers respond? What would media coverage be like? What could go wrong in terms of response? What were the weaknesses in quarantines, and so on and so forth, that might contribute to virus spread. So we did have a kind of red teamy player, but they weren't the virus. They were kind of everything else. The virus was was scripted, except for the script could change depending on what the players did. Now that worked very well in that particular game. I think always it depends on what you're trying to do. So one could run a game in which the virus is a player. One could run a game in which the virus is control, and control is essentially changing the pandemic in order to get the game to go in the places that are analytically or educationally useful. Or one can make the virus completely a game mechanism, as it is in the popular board game Pandemic, or the way that the earthquake is a game mechanic in Aftershock, the earthquake response game that I co-developed. So I think it entirely depends on what you're trying to get out of the game.
Okay.
And another question to ask is, do we understand the way that the virus acts? And at this stage, we have real world data. Our epidemiological models are quite good, and so the virus isn't making decisions. It's acting according to that model. So you can have a mathematical model that that you use to adjudicate as part of, along with human decisions, as part of the game. So we need to be careful about what it is that we're modeling and what are the questions that we seek to answer. David, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Hi, David Banks. I'm a professorial lecturer at AU, and as Ivanka said, I'll be starting at King's next fall, if we're all still able to fly then. I just had a question about regarding your point about matrix games, or something that Ivanka brought about matrix games, because it strikes me that the way that you've put your pros and cons for gaming, it is very much about the way it can be used, or a lot of used about how it can be used for like policy stress testing and effective forecasting. So does this mean that for gaming to be effective, you need to have actual policymakers, do you feel like, in the room, or is there a place for scholars to do gaming on their own, or for professional wargamers to sort of develop Kriegspiels on their own, or is this really is that when gaming goes kind of off the rails? Do you always need to have that kind of actual professional policymaker component to it?
No, you don't. I think it's absolutely the role that outside actors can do stuff which explores policy options, explores the drawbacks of policy, and so on and so forth. And you don't always need to have the policymakers in the room to be stress testing policy, because aspects of policy might be publicly announced. I do think if we're trying to be useful right now, we need to think about, we need to think critically about utility. And I do think as a group, we academics, I include myself, always tend to think that whatever we're doing is important and valuable. Whether it is or is not is another issue. So all I'm suggesting is take a step back, think about what am I contributing here, but also think if I'm going to do this, and I'm doing something out of a university research group, how am I going to make sure that the game outcome gets translated into, gets considered appropriately by the people I want to consider it. And I spent 2 years at the Canadian Foreign Ministry doing nothing else than essentially monitoring, supporting, interfacing with, contributing, and organizing academic sessions in order to inform aspects of ongoing Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And that was pretty much what I was doing all of the time. And much of the stuff that came out of academic communities was extraordinarily useful. In some cases, it ended up being negotiating language unknown to the academics who'd written it in the first place. So I'm not suggesting it's not useful. I am suggesting we need to think quite strategically about what are we contributing, who are we involving, how will our ideas get carried forward, and particularly right now, how will those ideas bounce around in the information context. So you do a game in which 25 million people die, and a reporter picks up on that, and that might have been your way out unlikely scenario, or you weren't quite gaming what people thought you were gaming. And as soon as that appears in the first news report, then, for the rest of time, it will be, Banks study shows 25 million about to die. So right now, that's the information environment we're in. So we need to be particularly careful about, how we output our games and how that information feeds into public and policy debate.
Well, thank you very much, Rex. So we'll turn to our second panel and we'll take a short break so the other presenters can get set up.
Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can hear me. Ivanka, I think, perfect. Very warm welcome back to panel 2. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Richard Sullivan. I'm speaking to you here from one of the COVID-19 epicenters at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, where we've got an interesting array of patients in, it seems in our, both in our ITUs and being hospitalized right now. I'm actually the co-director of the Conflict and Health Research Group. I've got despite my medical background, I've got a long history working in health intelligence, and I've formerly spent quite a few decades with defense intelligence working in this particular area, and I'm involved with various national responses now in that area. But that's enough about me. Let me talk about a little bit about this panel. We've got 3 fantastic presentations focusing on gaming within healthcare systems. First on around coordinated responses, the second around the use of mega games within the National Health Service, and finally on healthcare staff impact mitigation, one of the crucial issues that we're all facing at the moment. So without further ado, what I'm planning to do is getting maybe all 3 of them to do their presentations and their short talks, and then we'll take questions if we can right at the end. But if there's anything burning, that something you don't quite understand, please do send me the questions and I will stop things as we go along. But we've got about an hour for this particular session. So without much ado, Jenny Oberholzer, very warm welcome. Thank you very much for joining you. Jenny is actually doing her PhD at the University of St Andrews. And Jenny, if I could ask you to put your presentation up, and really over to you. Thank you.
So can everyone see this? Hopefully, we'll see.
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. All right, so I'm Jenny Oberholzer. Like was said before, I'm currently a PhD student at the University of St Andrews. Prior to that, I was actually, I'll actually get into the bio in a short moment. Anyway, this is Mercere Re Nobis, which is an in-joke for anyone who knows anything about Latin. This game is actually not about MRSA. That was just sort of the working internal title. It was about antimicrobial resistance. So we were basically brought in as an after add-on to a lot of the antimicrobial resistance work performed by RAND Europe. And again, I'll give you the quick details in a minute. So we were basically looking at any gaps that we could find with regard to coordination and overall response, and just see where we could take it. All right, so formerly of RAND, currently of Stern Pine Research. So if anyone wants some consultation on Wargames, I'm readily available. Currently a PhD student at St Andrews, prior DoD, prior RAND. All opinions are mine. They do not reflect current or former employers. And all the impressions you're going to see later on are from my own notes, not the publications that came out of this. So if you want to see any of that stuff, it's all available online. Cool. So this was basically the pitch. We were looking at AMR as an incredibly complex policy issue. RAND Europe had done a lot of work on the UK plan for AMR response, and generally thinking through what any given 5-year strategy would be. Apologies if you hear weird noises in the background. I've got a cat underneath my desk making a lot of noise. We basically got the opportunity to bring in policymakers from around the UK, and we're really, really lucky. We actually had Sally Davies herself there, and she was one hell of a player and a lot of fun. Also the chief veterinary officer. Basically what we were going to be doing was looking at possible updates and revisions to the AMR strategy and how it might be changed and follow-on strategies that came out of it, using kind of a One Health perspective. So you're looking at a One Health view of antimicrobial resistance by creating a sufficiently compelling narrative and sufficiently accurate game that would allow players to cooperatively respond to changing circumstances. And kind of like Rex was saying before, player responses actually need to be captured properly by the research team if you want to understand what's going on. So just running the game wouldn't be enough. We had to understand what decisions people were making and why they were making them. So the tools. This was a seat of the pants effort. This was part of what we called the Gaming Seed Grant, the opportunity in RAND to take gaming center expertise, gaming center skills, and throw them at a problem, really rapidly construct a good enough game for a good enough purpose in a short amount of time that wouldn't be purporting to give actual solid analytical outcomes. What we were doing was an exploratory game. We were trying to find gaps. We were trying to find problems, not necessarily solutions, because that wasn't actually going to come out of something like this. This was 3 AMR specialists, 3 basically health science researchers who'd been familiar with the problem and working on the problem for a long time. 1 junior game designer, myself, a senior mentor who we had kicking around who was willing to just sort of talk me through figuring out how to build this kind of thing, and a sufficiently mischievous college student. We basically tapped someone we had on hand who was readily available at the time because it was, I believe, spring break for him. And he was willing to just sort of play around with the game and break it for me. And then we had basically 10 allocated work days for the whole team. So you can kind of imagine how seat of the pants this was and why it was that we were determined to make something good enough, but we wouldn't be able to claim actual solid modeling and analysis necessarily coming out of this, but a really good way to kind of find gaps, explore those gaps, and maybe figure out new places to study, new places to look. So the design rules. And this is with a bit of a hat tip to Brian Jackson and Dave Frelinger. This is sort of our in-house team approach to how we would do things. There are a lot of other game designers out there in the world, a lot of other game designers, especially in RAND, who do all sorts of really cool things. But the 3 of us, when we were designing things, would generally stick to these rules. Keep it simple, because the cool stuff isn't coming out necessarily in the game itself, it's coming out in everything surrounding the game, in the discussion. Keeping it physical, and I know that's really hard, especially right now, which is why I don't think this approach would necessarily work at the moment, but we're primates, and engaging with the physicality actually really does make people seem to engage with the game in a different way. So if I give you 10 blocks, and I take 3 of them away from you, you have the physical act of me taking them from you, and it does seem to engage players in a really different way. Rather than me saying, okay, you've got 10 points, you've lost 3 of them, now you're down to 7. They don't get mad when you tell them they've lost points in the same way that they get mad if you actually take things from them physically. And part of what we wanted to do was keep them focused in that way. So keeping it focused, the way that we framed the game, everything that they walked in and saw on a table setting out was going to anchor the players in the way that they were approaching the problem. So whatever we put on the map, on the board, was going to be the focus of the problem for the rest of the day. So that had to be specific, that had to be tight, it had to be good. Keep it fast. Their time was incredibly valuable, and frankly, maybe not so much mine at the time, given the fact that I was a junior analyst, but nowadays, yeah, time is valuable. If people are giving you their time, you better make it worth it. Especially if you're trying to do something in the middle of, say, a major event happening around them. Luckily, this was prior to what's going on now. This was in 2017, so we had a lot more time, we had a lot more flexibility, but there were still crises that popped up. At one point, we had people having to step out because when you are in charge of things, well, you can't always be there. Keeping it fun and engaging. That's one of the things that you will see a lot if you've got a really engaging game and some really engaged players, is that they're going to start telling jokes. They're going to start knocking each other. They're going to be making fun of each other. They're going to make fun of themselves. And that, I think, is where a lot of the really interesting data really comes out. It's not necessarily, there's a degree of truth that will emerge, especially if you're, say, doing like a track 2 diplomacy game, where the things that people are ragging on each other for, that's something that may reveal how they feel a lot better than anything that they'll actually normally say in a serious voice. And of course, keeping it real, because anything that's incorrectly framed, anything that is incorrectly tuned is going to break the illusion for them, and they're going to be smarter than the game. So if they can improve it, if they can tell you why something is incorrect, you have to let them. And at the very least, you're going to probably find out something there that was wrong in your model initially. So also having kind of an open model, very important point. You don't want to have a black box, because if your black box is horrendously wrong, you lose all credibility. And of course, keep it friendly. So I like to, as a white cell or as a facilitator, have my white cell often basically also be kind of a pink team in some ways, because that gives the players the opportunity to feel like they're united against someone and they're fighting someone else. So that kind of intellectual metagame that you're building there is really cool, because you get all these interesting interactions and a lot of socialization that becomes really helpful as a side effect later on. And embracing that is kind of important. You can do the same thing with a red-blue team, red-blue dynamic, because your red team's going to really love each other by the end. All right, so breaking the game. One of the things that we did that we were really lucky with was we had Ian come in. Ian was almost done with college doing game design himself. He broke the game for me. He had no subject area expertise in what I built, which I'm going to get into shortly, but he broke it in a way that actually turned out to be kind of prescient, and I will get into that later. So the game itself, I'm going to have to pull up my notes on my cell phone because it's hard to do this on Zoom. Basically, this was a resource allocation game where resources were not necessarily money or manpower. It was political capital, political will, and also money and manpower. We all basically bulked it up into one big pile of resources, and then we shortchanged you. So we had a baseline map, which you can kind of see in the corner. Unfortunately, I don't have the final copy anymore because I've since moved on. But what we had was a map of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, London itself, the English countryside, and English cities. This was actually something that people critiqued us on later, suggesting that maybe we should parcel out the space a little bit differently, and that's something that we would definitely do if we played it again. On that game map itself, you can invest in monitoring and surveillance, prevention measures overall, and treatment and isolation measures. What you also have is an overall trust in government rating on kind of a pain scale smiley face that's in each region, as well as OECD countries and non-OECD countries, with the implication of little buses, trains, and boats that people can come and go basically as they please, more or less. Additional options for investment included surge capacity and research. And of course, kind of cribbing the concept of the treatment failure from pandemic and a few other places, repeated treatment failures leads to a higher rate of a resistant microbe spreading and the need for a much more expensive intensive treatment regime. So if that sounds kind of familiar, like the idea of a particularly virulent strain of something appearing and bubbling up and then spreading, yeah, it looks kind of sort of in some ways vaguely like pandemic, because you've got appearances, things shoot off. If there are enough of them in one space, they spread to elsewhere. But unlike pandemic, what we're dealing with here are 3 subject matter experts who kept backing me up, saying, hey, this is the statistical probability of, we'll say, a low rate of transmission. This is how likely it would be in any given chunk of time to spread. This is how likely it would be for you to be able to detect it if you knew how to detect it. The other thing that was kind of open book for players was the fact that there would be appearances on the map of a particular strain that they would see on the board, but it wouldn't have been detected. It wouldn't have been found by your resources that were in monitoring and surveillance. That's kind of a gameism. But fact of the matter is, if you were looking at something that vaguely resembles other strains of, say, bacterial infections, a particularly resistant form of bacteria showing up isn't necessarily going to be unusual, because like your baseline, the symptoms that you're seeing with patients might actually be really similar. So it wouldn't be detected as the separate strain unless they'd managed to detect it via the monitoring surveillance, which again was rated for statistical probability of success based on how much they'd invested. And of course, nothing's ever 100%. People make poor life choices, and sometimes you just get unlucky. But you know, it was interesting in that you would have to see something through monitoring and surveillance. You'd have to have invested for treatment and isolation. And also there are things that you could do to engage in attempts at prevention of overall transmission. Things like what you see now with these campaigns of people being told to wash their hands or social isolation, all of those measures. Of course, the one thing that made it a little bit different was the fact that your overall trust in government really, in a given region, would affect the probability of success of a lot of these measures. So if people just didn't believe you anymore, it just wouldn't work. Our starting premises were really simple. You can't treat what you can't see. You can't hit what you can't see. If you don't have monitoring and surveillance on the board, you're not going to be able to properly treat it. Trust is important, especially when you've got a big ask for people. So, and people don't like feeling shortchanged. So essentially, if you end up going below a particular floor with regard to investment in a given area, the overall trust might drop. It might not matter until later. But anyway, so here are our findings. These were findings that I walked away with. Other people might have other findings. We also had it set up so that we could play the virus, not the virus, the AMR strain, stress testing their response plan with particular event cards that we would tee up as we thought it was particularly important based on the conversation. We could have scripted that. We chose not to. We chose to stress test. Players found that a lot of the capabilities that they'd assumed existed weren't readily available for everyone. So like human health experts have a particular approach based on the NHS in the UK. Turns out that veterinary medicine operates in a completely different fashion, which is pretty obvious if you think about it, but at the same time, there are all these assumptions people were making. Everyone assumed that someone was handling communications, but no one was really clear on who that person was. Surge capacity, I don't actually have to read these, most of you guys can probably read, but these will also be readily available. And I should move ahead a little bit faster. But here's one of the things that I found really fascinating that in 2020 turned out to be an interesting breaking of the game and why you should definitely have someone do it. Ian tried something that no sane person would do. He just refused to invest in monitoring and surveillance. And one of the things that I see as someone who's an American living overseas is that's not a completely impossible path. That seems to have been the approach that certain states have taken. So that's just, it was one of those things where none of the public health players would have ever done that. We had a non-public health player try to do something that really wouldn't have been done. Oh, sorry, the dog's going off. Cool. So I'll just leave that there and stop sharing.
Jenny, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. And also thank you very much indeed for keeping so well to time. Really appreciate that. As I said, I think what we'll do is we'll run all the talks on and then have questions and answers at the end, if that's all right with everybody. So I just want to invite our next speakers from University of Manchester, Paul, Ben and Georgina. Paul House, I think you're going first, followed by, I think Georgina, you said second, and then Ben, and each of them are going to do about 5 or 6 minutes each. So that's super. Over to you. Thank you very much. You're on mute.
I'm unmuting now. Unmuting. Right. Thank you very much for that one, Richard. The first thing is I'm not actually University of Manchester. I'm Story Living Games, a game designer, educationalist, and I'm a reservist with 77 Brigade in the outreach side of things. So when somebody asked me, was I a webby person, I'm a Simlicky type person. So my background, as I say, is originally in education, designed mega games for a number of years, and about 5 years ago, I set up a group called Panelists Mega Games. I started to run them in the north of England, and Ben came along to a couple of our games. Ben is another game designer, and he said, my boss would love this. Can we get her to come along to a game? So that's brilliant. I wanted to come to a crisis management game. She came to the Jena campaign set in 1805. She played Marshal Blucher, 1806. She played Marshal Blucher for the day. I was a little bit concerned because she'd never come to one of these games before. And fortunately, she was still smiling at the end of the day. And what she did, her key takeaway was people making decisions based on the best available information and having real-time restrictions on that. So we went away. George went and found some money, which was great. And we have an output. And rather than me telling you too much about the game, I'm going to share a video link down here for everyone. And we're going to let everyone watch the video with your own sound, rather than trying to strain servers or something like that. And then what we're going to do is George will then talk a little bit about it, and so will Ben, in terms of where we're going to go with it from now. So let me just find the link again. I've had it several times.
I've got it handy if you need it.
Oh, it's there. It's there. So in the first run of the game, we actually had 2 hospitals running side by side with a few differences, mainly in terms of where we placed personnel to see if physical space made any sort of difference. So feel free to click on that one now. There is audio on it. It's on Vimeo, and anyone who's having any problems, just let me know on the chat bar, please. In fact, I should really watch it myself. Just remind myself when it's finished. How long is it? 5 minutes. 5 minutes, there we go.
Okay, I'll give everyone about sort of 5 minutes and then we'll crack on if that's okay.
Right, okay. I'm going to assume that the video's finished, if that's okay. Hello, my name's Georgina Moulton. I'm a professor of biohealth informatics and education at the University of Manchester. And as Paul alluded to, I experienced mega gaming for the first time with both him and Ben probably about 18 months ago. The reason why this piece of work was so important and was funded by the University of Manchester is that I am a health informatician by background, or a health data scientist, and we are looking to make sure that information gets into the right hands at the right time to influence clinical and operational decisions. It's very tricky to do this. Naturally, health informaticians and health data scientists do not work on the front line, so to speak, of clinical care. They are often working behind the scenes. And we needed a way of being able to show them what the environment was like and the types of operations and decisions that were being made. So hence we put together this entrusted mega game, which was really saw three things. One, we gave the experience of the front line, like I said, to those health informaticians and health data scientists. The second is around making sure that data or information is held by the right person and is given at the right time. And this is something obviously that data science, and we can expand on in the next mega game that Ben will talk about the importance of data, not just the importance of data for the decision making, but actually making that case to clinicians and other people of why it's important to code it in certain ways, what are the interoperability of systems, etc., and how that influences those decision making. And the third is around team science, something that we advocate at the University of Manchester and wider field at a national level now, is this appreciation of that most people do not work in isolation anymore, and particularly for health data science. And so we'd like to promote the diversity of skills from program managers to health data scientists to clinicians, and how can we get people to work together effectively, both for research and in other types of work. So those were really the three aims of why we thought funding this project would work. From a personal point of view, I'm an educationalist. I deliver large-scale programs for medical students and for health informaticians into the NHS. And this is a real opportunity to start to use simulation, and simulation's used a lot, to get them on board with this, not from a professional point of view, but earlier on in their career. I think the lessons that I certainly learned from working with Ben and Paul and doing the game, we've run it twice now. I think the video shows it the first time that we ran it, is, and why it's applicable to the current situation, is that hospitals are still running in the UK and internationally. We dealt with how do the operations of a hospital work. We look at focus on bed management, essentially supply and capacity. We look at how alignment of the board and managerial decisions impacted on those people that were delivering care. We looked at the speed of those decisions that were being made and the differences between how managers make those decisions and how clinical people on the wards were making those decisions, and at times how they were not aligned at all. So I think that those things that we started to learn about the management decisions, the clinical care decisions, the importance of data, the fact that a hospital is still running and the operations and supply and capacity and bed management, all those are still applicable to this current situation. And this is why I think the entrusted mega game could be adapted to the current situation. And those are the lessons learned. And so now I will hand over to Ben, who has a few further thoughts of how this can be done.
Georgina, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, just to kind of follow on from what George was saying, I mean, we're designed and trusted to be flexible and as faithful a representation as possible. And it was based off my background. So I used to work as a nurse. I was working in a post-operative recovery department for about 8 years, and then retrained to do game software, which obviously is completely different, and that's a whole other story. But the main point was, we were really hoping that some of the crazy behaviors that you see normal people with specific responsibilities did those things. So we focused specifically on the decision space rather than the exact mechanics of how something would work in a hospital setting. And actually, it's that flexibility that really has made us think wider than the initial scenario that we built. We built the system to be flexible so that odd behaviors that I was describing to Paul from my history could possibly come out without any further eliciting of that kind of work. And we found all kinds of crazy stuff. We found things that I'd seen in real life. We'd found in the latter run, we found people making decisions between patient lives and resources. And when we questioned whether it was because they thought it was a game, they 100% believed that somebody would die, but it was better that 2 nurses were freed up. So there was all kinds of odd decisions. And from the things that I'm hearing from my colleagues who still work in the NHS, similar, not necessarily as deeply troubling decisions as those, but similar decisions are being made that are very difficult for the practitioners to work with. And it's that element that really, I think, when we look at developing this further and maybe using it to learn some lessons for future issues.
Ben, you're freezing out at the moment.
Can be implementing so far is development of, sorry, my connection is unstable, so I might disappear sometimes. So I'll repeat stuff if it's lost. But we're looking at developing of Nightingale hospitals. So these are the temporary hospitals that the NHS is throwing up very quickly, very large bedded, short-term hospitals with a view to throwing them up in days, pulling them down in months, and how practical that is. We're looking at the benefits of having digital from the start. So learning by creating databases and data sets from the upfront. At the moment, any kind of game based in a hospital in the UK is working with legacy systems. So the idea of starting from scratch is a really interesting one for us. The distinction and the delay between implementation of government guidance and the actual benefit or challenges that they bring on the floor, and the breakage of communication between people from government to the hospital, right down to the individual practitioner and disagreements therein. Looking at the distinction between disaster planning and disaster management, and then throughout all of these scenarios, still trying to maintain an existing service. So hospitals don't just shut shop because we have a crisis to deal with. There are still issues that people need to work with that are the daily running of a hospital. So which things should be cut? How do we cut those? What are the implications of that? So these are all areas that we think we can expand with just simply by creating new content, not even necessarily creating new materials, because we had quite a comprehensive set. So that's really all I wanted to talk about without getting into questions, because it's quite a short slot for something that was quite a large part of our lives, I think.
Ben, thank you very much, and thank you to all 3 of you actually being so succinct. It's actually a terrific piece of work. As again, I'm going to hold questions right until the end because we've got a short presentation now from our last panelists. So if I could turn over to both Dave and Andrzej Frank, who are going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, the healthcare staffing impact mitigation, which I think, if I'm right, gentlemen, is actually a proposed project.
Yeah, that's right. It'll be myself, David X, will be presenting this afternoon.
So please, you can just power up your presentation now. That would be great. And then I said people can start thinking about the questions they want to ask and to whom. That would be excellent. I've got an absolute ton of questions myself.
Okay, can people see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent, okay. Well, thanks a lot for the organisers to give me the opportunity to talk about some thoughts we have around the area of health and care workforce planning. My name is David Exelby. I'm one of the founders and directors of Decision Analysis Services Limited. So we're a 50 strong organisation delivering strategy, operational research and project management into core sectors of defence, healthcare, energy and government. And it's Andre Frank, someone I've worked with for many years, who's the wargaming expert. I'm more of a strategy guy. So this is a proposed idea that's going to build on a current large piece of work that we're doing on strategic workforce planning for UK nurses. We're developing forecasting tools and projections on behalf of the UK's Health Foundation organisation. But that, of course, has been done, if you like, in peacetime scenarios, looking at healthcare demand over the next 20 to 30 years and nursing demand, not in the context of a sort of crisis COVID-19 situation. And that's what I want to explore today. So what is our problem area? Our focus, I think, in this, our interest is in health and care workforce resource planning, and we've seen amazing responses, of course, across many countries in reconfiguring their health systems to meet short-term peaks, including mobilizing their workforces. But I think we're particularly interested in that medium and long-term implications that this may have when we get what some people are terming as back to normal. Because if we think about it as generating huge backlogs of existing healthcare demand, and the changes that are taking place at the moment in the workforce in terms of the patterns of working, roles, workload, and attitudes can have long-term implications on the way the workforce could be organised in the future. So just to reiterate on this slide, we're focusing very much in terms of if we're playing a game in the game response of delivering supply against a particular demand that could be set up through a vignette. Going back to some of the discussions around epidemiology models and so on, we're not really, in this case, trying to represent an SIR infection model. We're much more interested as a game in trying to elicit and understand what are the drivers, levers and options of courses of action for players in terms of delivering workforce demand in that medium long term and indeed potentially short against a certain level of demand. So what we're doing is proposing a novel approach, which will be a seminar type war game supported by system dynamics. I'm a system dynamics specialist. I've used it throughout my career in my strategic planning work. And I'll say a little bit more about system dynamics on the next slide. I'm sure a number of you will be have some knowledge of it already. But I do want to emphasize already here that we're planning on using these system dynamic models qualitatively. So it'll be at the using causal influence diagrams, systems thinking approaches, rather than a large quantitative simulation model. And the game will consider vignettes across time horizons of interest. We play the game, but we'll be using these system dynamics models as a way of an organizing framework and for the players to actually articulate their understanding of the drivers of behavior and potential options going forwards. So I think already I'm just going to refer back to Rex's sort of list of what gaming can do, and I'm beginning to think that, reflecting on that, we're still very much in the kind of generating ideas, promoting cooperation, and potentially leading through ultimately to forecasting models. So what is system dynamic systems thinking? As I say, many of you will probably know, it's a well-established system science approach, and it's got a structured methodology, and it can actually go all the way from simple causal mapping and systems thinking through to quantitative computer simulation. And as I've said, we're intending to use it, in this case, qualitatively, to map out the system of acquiring, training, deploying, and retaining workforces. And I just show at the bottom a very simple example of the types of maps that we generate. Clearly, this is a simplistic one just to demonstrate the kind of symbology and the approach, and the actual one will be much larger. But we use these maps as ways to both express the vignettes to the players, and they also use that, if you like, as the templates by which to expand and enhance and add to thinking about what the drivers are, what the levers available, and the options. And they can do those in separate groups and then bring them back together to get this sort of collated, shared view. And we have actually been using this sort of approach in that current work that I introduced at the start. We've not been doing it in a gaming environment. We just simply be having a kind of workshop. So again, going back to Rex's point, it would be quite interesting on people's views on what type of gaming would work best, or if it's the right approach. So as I said before, the key points of system dynamics really is that it can explain behavior and structure, dynamic behavior, represent cause and effect, and it provides a simple structured framework to articulate the drivers, levers, and options. Okay, quickly move on. So the architecture that we're thinking about is a pretty standard, I guess, seminar war game in terms of cycles, and how might we put that together. So clearly, all the lessons we've been hearing at the top of this workshop, a lot of work that will be done on preparation. We've got a lot of historic analysis already around healthcare supply and demand across workforces, and we'll collate that along with more current sources around the pandemic and where we think it'll end if we were looking at our medium-term view to create our vignettes. And at the same time, of course, we'll be developing our SD maps. Now, these maps will be quite simplistic in terms of they'll define the overall structures and pipelines and stocks of the workforce. And then it'll be up to the game players to start to consider and think about how they can actually influence some of those key transitions, be it retention, attraction, training, delays, and so on. And those will get captured in the maps through the game. So the idea is we'll present it, because we're doing it as a game, there'll be some vignettes that are presented, probably 2 within each of the time horizons, focusing on a particular situation. And then our groups will identify these drivers, levers, and courses of action and use the maps to articulate it. So we will have some facilitation and experts to help the players actually annotate those maps. Those will be collated for plenary and discussion to agree a consensus, and potentially those obviously then get fed forward to next vignettes that could be used when looking into the next time horizon. And we do believe that careful planning could let us achieve that with online tools. So in terms of the game's outline, there's quite a bit of text on this, but just some highlights. We want to focus on accepted challenges in supply in the medium and long term. That will be our key goal, though recognizing some of the knock-on consequences of the short-term work that may have to be done to meet workload. We know there's long-term challenges, I should say, anyway, with our current work before the COVID-19 pandemic even occurred in the UK, in terms of resourcing nurses, for example. And we consider using at least 3 groups within the seminar war game, one representing health and care roles, one for policy, and perhaps wider public responses and attitudes will need to be considered as well. There was some talk already around sort of the advantages of adversarial approaches, and we think this may help shift any entrenched positions. And as I said before, we'll be using the game really to surface the drivers, levers, and courses of action. And we see the SD maps will evolve and B, throughout the game as it progresses. And finally, just a few thoughts on benefits. We believe that back to normal is a critical challenge that ministries are focusing on in this work. In fact, from our own contacts, we know the Department of Health in UK are already doing a lot of work around this back to normal challenge. We have used this approach, although not through the vignetting, already with extensive workshops using these types of SD models and using groups to think about the drivers, options, courses of action. But they've been under these kind of peacetime strategic workforce planning scenarios. But it's been very well received, and certainly we've managed to get hold of a wide variety of organisations in the UK representing NHS providers, Public Health England, Royal Colleges of Nursing, and unions as well, all participating together. So I think it ticks very much that box about promoting cooperation, generating ideas, and creating shared understanding. So we do believe that it wasn't done as a war game to date, but extending it to incorporate specific COVID-19 challenges will produce valuable insights. And it could be done, of course, at national, regional, or local levels. I haven't specified this here. And I guess finally, I think we'd welcome any opportunity to work with others on this approach, or indeed offer any of our knowledge that we have on strategic workforce planning that we've done in healthcare over a number of years now. Thanks a lot.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, David. And really, let me just open it up really for questions, answers and comments as well. We've had a lot actually to think about here. Maybe I can kick off whilst people are thinking. I mean, really to all of you, something that keeps coming out here, I guess, is the feasibility and utility of some of these approaches when the crisis has started. And I'm picking up particularly on Jenny's point that obviously now social distancing means social distancing for everybody, but simply the kinetics of what's happening as well, and the fragmentation either at hospital level or generally at different levels. So maybe, I don't know who wants to pick up on that. Maybe start with the kind of question of the utility of these approaches now the crisis is underway. Where do you think the utility is? And more importantly, what can we learn and what data do we need to capture at the moment for doing this sort of preparedness work in the future?
I guess I could start. I mean, in terms of the wargaming we were proposing with our systems maps, then I think it's, I mean, we've kind of run these before, obviously in a big workshop, getting everyone together, and you get all those positive dynamics that we all know about. I do think with online tools that our approach, we believe we would be able to do it. It would take a huge amount of extra planning and trialing and so on. But you know, the idea is that these maps actually are intended to create this kind of shared template, if you like, on which people can express their thoughts. Indeed, one of the thoughts around when we use our system dynamics approach is this idea of creating shared mental models. You know, you create a structural model that everyone agrees about, right, and they don't start, they can move on from arguing about the structural shape of the model and on to kind of what I was talking about before, is the courses of action and levers available. Yeah. And I think in our case, although it will take a bit of work probably to generate that initial map going into such a game, what we found so far is it tends to be not particularly controversial, if you like. That template we use, the discussion comes, of course, is on the ability and the levers and ideas in which to influence some of the pipes and flows to move particular workforce elements from one state to another, or indeed in the UK often stopping them, draining out to a state where they're not being productive. Yeah.
So it's picking up on that, because there's a comment here from Mark about the key thing to Wargame now is to model ending the lockdown in a world infected with it, in terms of using international exchange of people and goods. And obviously, you'll all be very well aware that, you know, last lockdown may help manage and mitigate some of the issues around COVID-19 infection with our vulnerable patients. It also means lockdown can mean lockout to patients accessing care. And we're already seeing downside effects on this. So maybe taking that comment from Mark is to Paul and the others is, how can your approaches be used to help this idea of an exit strategy and developing exit strategies, and how might that be possible? Or to anyone, in fact, David, Jenny.
To be honest, because I'm presenting later in the afternoon and looking at civil society a bit more, I think one of the things is we can actually use this to get people to understand that there will be a new normal. And I think people are assuming things will be just as they were before. And this is a major, but never mind the economic impact, this is a major social impact on the globe. So this idea, I think, that we'll just suddenly go back and just, it will be as it was before, I'm not sure that actually is possible. And we've got some time, I think, to think about that. But I think it's actually about managing expectations as well. So in the game that we're talking about, I think that would be a case, just as MRSA or something like that is something that hospitals plan for and routinely have to consider in their day-to-day practice, then COVID-19 would be one of those things that actually has to come in, and there are protocols, and it becomes part of the regular decision-making that takes place and in our resilience planning. So I think, yes, there is an exit strategy from the restrictions, but actually there's also a, just don't think this is going to be the end of it, and I think we can contribute to that.
I guess from my side, I carefully have been looking on the supply side rather than worrying about, you know, releasing the demand side. But I would agree with the last comment that there's going to be a new normal. If you think about the reconfiguration that's taking place, and likely workforces having different roles, enhanced roles, you know, can you put that back in the bottle afterwards? Yeah, it's an opportunity for major change, I think, in terms of roles. It may even throw up changes in terms of length of training and all kinds of things like that. And that's sort of what we were interested in. But, you know, in a way, what I'm proposing wasn't trying to understand, if you like, that huge national level of kind of the economic engine, if you like, making sure that gets up and running again.
Jenny, do you want to, did I see your hand there, Jenny?
I'd say two things. One, that was one of the most sort of damning things that came out of the game that we did, and probably the best learning point for me and hopefully everyone else in the room, was the degree to which communications is utterly vital, and your failure to communicate properly to the general public is just going to consistently undermine your believability and your credibility from then on out. You can see this today with the current debate in the US regarding whether or not people ought to wear face masks going out to the grocery store. Like the fact that one message came out first and then a second message came out after, and God only knows what the message is going to be in 2 weeks. One of the things that we ended up having a really big discussion about during the game was, hey, we've got all these really great scientific minds in the room, all these really brilliant people involved in public health, animal health, environmental health, all of that. No one actually understands how to properly communicate this kind of thing. So your science journalists, your science comms people, those people are utterly vital. And if they're not involved at the beginning, they're not involved in planning, you're hosed.
So can I ask you all, how do you, one of the hallmarks with the COVID-19 is just the uncertainty due to lack of testing, uncertainty as well, and interpretation as well of the extant data that we're dealing with, both at a sort of epidemiological level and clinical level. How do you manage, in terms of your gaming and your approaches, to deal with that level of uncertainty as it shifts around?
I think I can speak on Entrusted. Like, that level of uncertainty kind of exists in semi-exists from a ground level in acute services anyhow. So the decision spaces that we're modeling in Entrusted are working with a degree of uncertainty anyway. So I think managing Well, I mean, I'm thinking specifically about interesting. I'm still ticking over of how this works in the sort of Perry situation. I don't see it working brilliantly in the mid Perry situation because it really requires the confusion and the temporal loss of information. So something that is fact at the start may still be fact at the end, but may have been forgotten by every player. And I think issues like that don't tend to work so well virtually. And I think you need the numbers of people in order to make the machine process enough so that people are dealing with actual problems that they may actually face from a conceptual perspective. So I think really like the uncertainty about, I think my comment probably is that the uncertainty really needs to be thought about from the perspective of the decisions we're trying to elicit and trying to understand. So I think if we're making complexity from a strategic level or from a governmental level, then that is literally, we don't know where it's coming from, we don't know who has it, we don't know how to track it, and we don't have any tests for that. So it's gaming that problem. If it's from the ground level, it's this next patient may have it, your best mate's told you that if you hold your breath and drink a lemon, then you won't get it. What does that do to your decisions, you know?
I think what's interesting, I think I mentioned in the talk, is the actual epidemiological SIR model structurally is very sound. There's no big arguments about that. And in a way, it's a sort of model boundary problem. You know, we need to open up the boundary of the model, because it's the structural elements that decide on the behavior that affects those key parameters which we don't understand. I get that, but what if we did know them? Then we probably do have a pretty good idea on what the behavior, you know, the numbers of infected and so on would be. I saw, Richard, you were either nodding or disagreeing with that on the.
It's a discussion for another day.
All right, okay.
Modeling and arguments with John and Neil and all the rest of them. So I've got a comment here from a question really from Peter. How did you attempt to get insights of the games into the heads of actual decision makers who are not participants in the games? So if you weren't actually there, how do you transliterate the findings into the heads of others who weren't present?
I think, again, from my case, like, I know people sort of not in a senior policy position, but who have seen similar questionable decisions. And when I relay the decisions that I've seen from the game, they can relate to people making true life decisions that are sort of paralleled with those. So it made it much easier to talk about this as a prospect for their own staff or for their team. So I think, again, to just say, we initially kind of thought of Interested as a way to kind of explain the NHS to somebody who doesn't know it. So we wanted some clinicians in there to sort of validate that it did meet their expectations. But we found that clinicians that were in there gained valuable perspective on other roles within the hospital and were able to use those in interactions later on. So I can only really speak anecdotally. We've run it twice. We've had 50, 60 people in total who've played it. So I keep in touch with a few of those people, and they say that it has been valuable for their work and their perspective, definitely.
Look, I'm really sorry. I'm just realised the time here, and Ivanka's going to grip me in a minute if I don't call this panel to a halt. There's an awful lot to talk about. Thank you all very much for your presentations. They're absolutely fantastic. Giving me certainly a lot to think about. And I think we've got a short break now, and for about 5 minutes until 2:35 until the next session.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Banks. I'm chairing this next panel regarding the international domestic politics of the crisis. So we've got a number of presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and just ask Benjamin Williams first to present his work, and then we'll move on to the next two panelists. And I hope that I encourage everyone to try to be as succinct as possible, so we leave plenty of time for Q&A. So please, Ben, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you, David. So I share the documents.
Should be able to share it from your screen. That's it.
Yeah. I think it's okay now. It's okay?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, I start. So, okay, sorry. So first of all, I'm very, very happy to be here today. I would like to start with a brief disclaimer. So with quotation fingers. So I'm not a wargaming professional. I'm a professor of finance and financial economics in a French university in Clermont-Ferrand. However, I'm a long-term wargaming and role-playing games hobbyist since 30 years. So being here today is like winning the gold for me. So I present my project of analytical war games. So the project also takes place in a new program in crisis management in my school. So the aim of the project is to develop a set of matrix game with two main goals. The first goal is to help identifying the side effects of both the health and economic responses to the pandemic. The other goal is to provide tools for the assessment of both private and public responses to the pandemic. And I would like to stress the importance of private responses in this crisis, because my opinion as an economist and as a professor of finance is that they can propose very effective responses to the pandemic. Why matrix games? So matrix games, they were invented by Chris Engel. They were first published in the Nudget in 1988. And he was talking about verbal analysis war games, so mainly based on words more than numbers. And I think that they are highly suitable for the context of the pandemic. I have quoted on the slide something taken from the book by Curry and Price, and they said they are well suited for complex conflicts, issues involving multiple actors, stakeholders, and a broad range of dimension, social and economic dimensions. So they are also well suited when we face a novel situation. This is also pinpointed by Curry in a book. And the pandemic is typically a novel situation, what we call in finance the black swan. And I think that even in I'm a guy from quantitative method as a professor of finance. I think that the ensuing social dynamics cannot be modeled very well based on a quantitative approach, because we lack data and because the reality is too complex. This is also the Austrian School of Economics way of considering the situation. So I think that they are really interesting, the matrix games, and they well fit the modeling and the pandemic. And just also to say that some matrix games have already been proposed about the pandemic. For example, there is a game written by Tim Price, Flattening the Curve, which is available online on the excellent PAX Sims website. So my presentation is, so I will present the rational, the analytical framework of the presets rules of the game design itself very quickly, and a brief roadmap. So the idea of the rational is that the pandemic is more than a major sanitary crisis. It's becoming a global crisis with both economic and social components. So according to the IMF, the pandemic may cause a recession at least as bad as during the global financial crisis. It was said by the managing director of the IMF. And in the long run, the recession may cause an abnormal mortality rate due to the worsening of credit conditions. This is very important because there is a well-established body of knowledge published in medicine journals, mainly in the Lancet, for instance, showing that the worsening of economic conditions lead to more suicide, more cancer. So economic downturn is also in the long term an health issue. And this is, to sum up in one sentence, the rationale is from health issues to economic and social issues and back again. So why is it, in my design, in my opinion, it's mainly a social crisis. Also, this is not only a sanitary crisis, because in the absence of vaccines and medical treatment, we all know the goal, and the goal is to flatten the curve, to spread over time the influx of new patients in hospital. And to answer the crisis, the pandemic, so we use mainly two social treatments. So what I call, is the first card on the left, the light social treatment, social distancing, testing people, and focused quarantine. So this is the case mainly, for instance, in South Korea and in Southeast Asia. But we also have a heavy social treatment consisting in a massive lockdown at the country level, with movement restrictions, law enforcement, and border shutdown. And today, if you check the websites and the news, we can consider that between the third and the half of humanity is locked down. And such a lockdown has major economic consequences. So this slide is just a big picture of the consequences. The idea is not to make the laundry list. So the first of all, we already observe an economic shrinkage, a huge shrinkage of economic activity, a rise in unemployment. In France, we have 2 million people with short-time working these days. And just to give you a number, in France, we consider that 1 month of lockdown means minus 3% of growth on the GDP at the end of the year. We think that we'll have a minimum of 2 months of lockdown, so minus 6. And if you compare this number with what happened after the financial crisis, it was minus 3%, okay? So it would be worse. So we also have experienced some stock market crash, but we may also have a banking crisis, and in the worst case scenario, bank failures. We have the problem with the burden of debts, and etc., etc. So in order to mitigate the consequences of the economic downturn, the governments and the central banks have decided to implement emergency interventions. So this is always the business as usual. They use their two main tools. So on the one hand, the budget policy, okay, recovery plans, tax cuts, and they use monetary policies to supplement the banks with liquidity to avoid a banking crisis. However, we must address and assess these policies, because the magic of money does not exist. This is not just a symptomatic treatment. And the economic system, we must never forget that it relies first on the workforce. So there are also some social consequences I have listed. For instance, the spread of rumors, more addictions, domestic violence, and street demonstration, which is very important in France because we all fear a rebirth of the Yellow Vest movement in France. So the idea is to use this rationale focused on side effects, I mean economic side effects and social side effects of the pandemic and back again, using a matrix games. So this is an ongoing project. So just a few words about the game design. The idea is to follow the common practices defined by, once again, Curry and Tim Price. They are excellent. And the idea also is to have a matrix games using the system of the pro and the cons with the fog of war. not all the matrix games have a fog of war system, but I think that this is very important to fit the situation and to model the assessment of the responses and the identification of the side effects. So for the actors, this is just a big pictures. They are to be determined based on both the rational and the scenario. And just to finish, because I think that the 10 minutes are over, my roadmap is, so this is an ongoing project. I identify the priority themes, write up as soon as possible a first game, organize, so communicate and make the game publicly available, communicate the results of the first game. I would like to take the opportunity as an academics to also make some publishing. And last but not least, I would like also to build a team. So if you're interested in participating in the project, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. And that's my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Benjamin. Now can I ask Danius to present his research, or his proposal rather.
Sure. Benjamin, would you mind stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much. Just a moment. And there we go. Does that work?
That's perfect.
Wonderful. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Danius Balčytis. I personally come from social studies background, so more history, international relations, and military studies, rather than epidemiology and other fields of study that potentially could be more useful in a pandemic scenario. But nonetheless, I have had a lot of experience organizing various simulations. Well, not a lot possibly in comparison with the rest of the panel, but over the past 6 years, I have organized 11 different simulations. One of them has been, as a matter of fact, in 2018 on Ebola. So we have simulated the spread of it. But what we have done was we focused on the social effects of it. And so we come to what I would like to talk about today, and that is House Divided, a simulation of COVID-19 response in Europe, which we are preparing with Emerging Threat Assessment Project, of which I am research coordinator. In my day job, I have to come forward with this. I do work for European Union, in particular European Commission, but here I'm in purely private capacity representing Emerging Threat Assessment Project, which is a network of junior professionals and researchers. There is 17 of us in total, and we were thinking that we are finding ourselves currently in a very interesting situation where essentially if we'll have a look at the heat map with COVID infections, we are seeing something that is completely unprecedented. And in particular, I would like you to pay your attention to this graph here. Important thing about it is that out of 6 top countries that have been affected by COVID, and affected not just by infections, but by deaths, which implies to a big extent lack of appropriate response, 4 of them are located in Europe. And Europe, many people could argue, is possibly the best connected continent in the world. There are lots of institutions. Most of the countries are very well developed, have well implemented health protection policies and so on. So it is indeed something that is raising a question. How are we in this situation that our response has been less than ideal? And because of that, we would like to organize a simulation event which would take use of this unprecedented situation where indeed, as Benjamin also pointed out, we have about 1/3 of humanity in lockdown, and use the uniqueness of this situation to see how do simulations work in essentially a remote environment where everyone is online and everyone is in this heightened state of alertness due to the current situation. So yeah, in particular, we would like to see, as I mentioned, because unfortunately we don't have the necessary health related background to touch any of the topics related to epidemiology and so on. These are not the questions that we would like to address. So instead, we will be trying to focus on that what we know best, and that is where were the failures in political response? Why do we see the current situation playing out the way it did in Europe? In particular, we would like to look at what were the causes for the fact that indeed we have this almost game theoretic response where everybody is doubling down on simply national measures when potentially some of the countries have been really unaffected. And they could have provided help to others, but they have chosen not to do so. So in terms of game design, because one thing that I would like to note is everything that I'm presenting here is currently just a draft. It is a wish list, so I very much welcome any comments or ideas, and this is all subject to change. So please take it with a pinch of salt, and if you think that something would make sense to change or something, I'm very, very happy to hear from you guys. So I will provide my contact details at the end of the presentation. So we were thinking that it would make most sense to have participants represent different states, both European states and non-state actors, including some major global players. And we would be trying to do it not in laboratory conditions, not in isolation from the rest of the things, because in our brainstorming so far, we think that there has been a conglomeration of different different pre-existing conditions that led to this breakdown of coordination, including vying for reputation. For example, we've seen China quite aggressively trying to manage their image on the international arena. Also, there are other things like geopolitical interests, considerations of economic impact, and obviously, last but maybe not least, the reduction of infections and casualties. So actors will be trying to find a balance between all of those. In addition to that, we know that there are many different resources they can take and utilize at their disposal, but not all of them will be available from the very beginning. And even the resources, not all of them are of the same quality, because, for example, some of the doctors, let's say some of the healthcare systems are very well suited to operate internationally and possibly to be sent abroad to help out other states, while others are, let's say, more focused on just helping out people in their own level, both due to language barriers and due to existing infrastructure and so on. We are not sure yet what would be the correct level of complexity for this, but in terms of some of the resources we are thinking about, you can see them on the screen. However, it must be noted that we are not doing a quantitative analysis. We don't have either the resources or the time to prepare a robust enough game design to even approach it from that perspective. So what we are trying to look at more is dynamics, and because of that reason, resources will be more proportional to state budgets rather than based on verified data. And obviously, we are all in state of chaos, possibly a little bit anecdotally, but I myself working for European Union can see very closely how, let's say, big bureaucracies are reacting to this. And I can also see to a certain extent how in different states it works differently. So some states are more decentralized, which seems to help them with localized response, and but also at the same time, it means that if you're trying to get everybody to do something at once together, it is a little bit more complicated. However, we are only flirting with mobilization mechanic for the time being, and we would be very much interested to hear if any of you have conducted in the past any war games where mobilization of resources was a question and was under consideration. So, and obviously, as our participants would be representing state negotiators and policymakers. They would have access to a number of different policy options. But we don't want to create a predetermined tool set because, as I mentioned, we are hoping for a more exploratory simulation. So we will be encouraging more involvement and imagination as well, because possibly we might have something that nobody has ever thought about. Though, as Professor Brynan has pointed out at the beginning of this workshop, most likely no silver bullet will appear. We are more aiming to understand like what might have caused the dynamics, but still it is very interesting to see. So, and obviously, because as I mentioned, this situation is unique, we are very interested to see how, let's say, even negotiations themselves and interaction will be shaped by the tools that we have. Because we are all working online nowadays, and even this workshop is conducted on Zoom, this will potentially, or maybe not, bring in a different level of engagement and how that works. So we are looking, we are waiting eagerly to hear from our participants essentially what was their experience in trying to coordinate either bilaterally or while engaging on a broader context or a wider public forum on the issues online. And results. This is a little bit of a tricky area, and we are still wondering how it would be best to measure the success at mitigating the impact. But at the moment, we don't think that there will be either right or wrong results, essentially because same policy outcomes motivated by actor preferences could be achieved either by trying to work only within the boundaries of your own state and possibly just having some bilateral engagements, but also we will be looking at how that works out Europe-wide. We are considering using an external model, potentially something such as this. Let me know if you can see my screen still. Does that work?
We can see something. It's like
yes. So this is, for example, one of the simulators that we were considering of using. It's a very simple one, base model that was prepared based on WHO's.
Sorry, Dennis, I'm not sure
yeah.
we can actually see it. I think we need to see sort of a gray block.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. Just a moment then. I am going to just. Can you see it now, please?
We can still just see your slideshow.
Okay, I see. So it must be a Zoom thing. Then it doesn't matter. I will just share the link in the chat. It's a very simple model that is essentially calculating potential casualties based on the percentage of people that decide to hold to quarantine and stay at home. While, for example, if the numbers go down, it's my apologies. I just got a little bit lost in the Zoom while trying to share it.
Yeah, it's not the best. Sometimes it can get a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
Your slideshow is...
The slideshow is up, right?
It's on the panel. It's on the... We can see all the background stuff. I don't know how to describe it, all the overheads.
Okay.
Yes, there we go.
That works fine, yeah?
Yeah.
So, but we are still just wondering about that idea and whether it's even appropriate for us to try to measure something like that, because it wouldn't be meant to actually represent what casualties would be inflicted on the population. It's rather just as a consideration to help people measure possibly the effects of their own results. But that leads to a lot of concerns. First of all, we want to provide a framework that wouldn't be forcing participants towards a particular set of conclusions or particular actions. We're not trying to just get everyone to artificially coordinate when we see that, let's say, in practice that doesn't happen. It's more about trying to get them to actually simulate the way they would under normal conditions. And also, as pointed out in previous presentations, communication of findings, that would be a big question on how is it best to do that. Furthermore, discussion of sensitive topics, because we're both thinking about whether it's even appropriate to talk or estimate which policies would lead to higher or lower casualties, and also about potential political implications, which cannot be completely ignored, because a lot of people are already making a lot of assumptions on things. For example, Russians providing help to Italians could be and has been perceived as Russian PR stunt. At the same time, existing animosities or social issues such as, for example, Brexit, or issues with Hungary or other European states could lead to tensions in the public, both in terms of perception of cooperation with other states in Europe and within themselves. So yes, and also obviously we want to capture at an appropriate level of complexity with a number of people from diverse fields who would be involved, so that it wouldn't be just, let's say, people who are primarily from the Brussels bubble, so to say, and we would want to get involved people who are both themselves working in the medical fields and ideally from other states too. So and also we are planning to run it under lockdown conditions. So we want to do it online. Ideally, it should take 3 days. 1 day is supposed to simulate about 2 weeks of simulation time, and allow flexible participation for people. So because we know that doesn't matter that we're working remotely, everybody still has their commitments and so on. So we would be essentially doing updates from the control panel 2 times a day based on the actions that would be communicated to us throughout the day at times appropriate to people. And it would be scalable in size depending on the level of interest and what we see that works best. So yeah, so I think that's my time up, and I would just like to thank in advance for any feedback that you might have, criticism as well, because as I mentioned, we are junior researchers, despite of the previous simulations that we have run and so on. This one is the first one that we would be doing online and on such a serious, sensitive topic. So if you would like to either provide feedback or some organizational support, some experience from your previous simulations, or just to participate, don't hesitate to throw me an email. That would be much appreciated. So thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Dennis. And then finally, we have a presentation from James Fielder on a project called Fearless Horizon.
Sweet. So yes, while I'm loading this up, speaking of pets, if anyone hears pigeons in the background, that's how I got my nickname. If you hear the cat can't get to the pigeons. And if you hear someone holler at me in about 10 minutes, it's my wife coming upstairs asking who I'm talking to. And all right, let's see. Is it full screen on your end?
Yes, it is.
Sweet. All right. So yeah, so short introduction. Yeah, go by Pigeon. I'm a retired associate professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. And I did a military exercise and wargame design on behalf of the Army and the Air Force from about 1997 to 2019. And starting in 2006, during my first tour of the Academy, I also started studying emergent politics inside of game environments, like i.e. how do people form societies inside of World of Warcraft, EVE Online, Dungeons and Dragons. I have a book chapter coming out in June on studying Denver area Vampire the Masquerade players and how they perceive power. So I've been interested in this topic for quite a while. You'll see in the agenda, it's a single author, but I did add a co-author, one of my colleagues, Jennifer Maven Scheidenfeld. She's an experienced role-playing game designer, editor. She works for both my company, Liminal Operations, and as editor and game designer for Evil Beagle Games. And the genesis for this game, it was actually when I was teaching comparative authoritarianism at Colorado State, where I'm teaching now. I like to end courses with games of some sort or simulations of some sort, so I can observe how well students have absorbed the course material. And I kid you not, totally coincidental, I did a game for comparative authoritarianism on a virus response, called it Virus 47, where I divided the course up into different types of authoritarian states, and they had to try to fight the virus based on how the expectations of their state's regime type. Nice for class, I didn't really write it down. I've published games before in the past, but I didn't write this one down. But then, wouldn't you know, 2 weeks ago, King's College London sends an email, says, would you like to do a research project? And there I am at 3 in the morning, questioning my mortality and my life's choices. And I said, yes, absolutely. Let me write this down. How long do you have? 3 days. Perfect. I'll put a pot of coffee on. So this is a modification of Virus 47. And I got together with my team, and we wanted to proceed forward to develop primarily an analytical war game to rapidly generate hypotheses and follow-on strategies to ensure facilities have resources to combat the virus. And it's very much a distance and resource-focused game. And similar to the previous speaker, I'm not a healthcare provider. I can do the logistics part, but I'll leave the how a pathogen spreads to someone a little smarter than I am. Alternatively, this could be applicable as a training war game if done correctly, but right now focus on analytics. But since for good science, and since the real money is made in downloadable content and plush action figures, I want to make this generalizable to other logistics problems in crisis scenarios beyond just healthcare. But then that's not a priority. In addition, I think this could also be easily modifiable at a strategic level, operational, and tactical. And this is where, if I could hear Jim Dunnigan or Peter Pearl in my head saying, don't mix the streams, I'd say you're absolutely correct. Ideally, I'd create, if I was going to proceed with another mod of this game, I would say this is a strategic game, this is an operational game, or tactical, and it's built specifically for that purpose. So I'm not mixing levels. With that, all right, let me be clear. PhD in political science. However, I have the mathematical modeling skills of a 6-year-old. I count with my fingers. I'm lucky if I can balance my checkbook to the nearest nickel. However, I conceptualize this as quickly as some sort of model that I could express mathematically. And let me, to put it even simpler, I taught the Air Force war game design course in fall of 2018. And we like to do game deconstruction during class so students can learn like what makes a good game work, what's bad, what are good mechanics. And the games that usually resonated with my students the most were the ones that they could sit down, open, and start playing. They got into the magic circle right away. They got into the synthetic experience right away. The ones that didn't resonate were stuff like terraforming Mars, where it took them an hour just to unbox it. So I thought if I was going to use this in an educational environment, a training environment, or an analytical environment, I basically want it to be easy to understand, easy to deploy with simple variables. Stick into Einstein, make it simple as possible, but no simpler. So I envision this as a triangle model where it's basically saying using distance, resources, and personnel, or some measurement of those, I can generate an infinite number of hypotheses through an infinite number of scenarios that are based on these 3 variables accounting for some error. Now, obviously, infinite number of hypotheses for an infinite number of scenarios is not particularly useful for a crisis. You want to simplify it in some way, which I'll get to in the next slide. Now, this is the model of a over-caffeinated madman. The actual game will not look like this. It is not a mathematical game. It is not a computerized game. The intent is to make it human-on-human interaction. Decisions against a thinking opponent, or going back to Dr. Mouton or Dr. Exelby with the physical pieces. The player walks in, they can see it, they can touch it. Again, it builds the magic circle, and like they know now they are about to not just play a game, but immerse themselves in activity where the learning is real. So I took this and we said, let's take away the infinite surface of the triangle and bury it down to what we think are the 3 most likely scenarios you'd have to play in a crisis response. Although I did think of a 4th, but I'll table that for a second. Starting with the long horizon, the fearless daybreak. This is where I would take the player teams. It could be countries, it could be not NGOs, it could be IGOs. with it. They don't have an known infection, but their lines of communication in some way are infected. So it would be like someone playing Britain or the City of London saying, hey, we know China has this many infections. Beijing has a line of communication with us. What does that mean for us? How do we respond ahead of time? How do we get ahead of the curve to combat this? So it becomes, I think, a little more of a thoughtful, strategic chess move kind of game. But then I start ratcheting up the stress. Fearless Penumbra, that's where now they're in a dyad problem. They're where they know at their border there's infected personnel on their local lines of communication at their major ports of call. And now the reaction time is a lot shorter. So, okay, now this ratchets up the stress. Going back to Huizinga's magic circle argument, the creation of the stress focuses their decision-making, so the decision-making would a little more accurately reflect the reality of how they might handle an actual crisis. And finally, at least for this deck, was the Fearless Eclipse. This is where, okay, they're at the peak, or they're really dealing with, we're missing key personnel. We are missing, a third or more of our population is in quarantine, and that's probably looking overly optimistic now. Hospitalized or sadly deceased. This is a kind of thing where, I would go to President Trump and say, you have an entire city on lockdown. Or I would go to a company and say, your entire corporate suite is out with the illness, or one of them is dead. How do you handle the situation? But listening to everyone talk, this has been a great panel so far this morning. It seems like this is right now great to do, okay, after the fact analysis of how you handle a crisis, this is what we should have done. Because, well, as I like to tell organizations, hopefully the first time you respond to a crisis isn't an actual crisis, but you've thought about this before. However, there's a lot of murmuring, low-level commentary. Actually, it's far more bubbling to the surface now of, we need to think about, we're in the crisis now. If we haven't gamed it, we're figuring out as we put the pieces in front of us. What do we do after that? What do we do in 2 months? What do we do in 6 months, 8 months? How do we recover from this? So that would be Fearless Tomorrow or Fearless Dawn, where we say, the crisis is over. You are your country teams, but now you're standing there holding the bag. How do you proceed forward? How do you open your ports up again? How do you bring people out of quarantine? How do you rebuild trust with a population that is, skittish, frightened, has various levels of trust for different parts of the government? And there's going to be moving forward, there could be a lot of fruitful analysis from that as well. So we expect that this simple to play, simple to design game, partially illustrated with my capstone exercise below, will generate rapid, reliable, valid, and relevant and timely hypotheses that can be acted on immediately, particularly for logistics planning. Again, not how do you combat the virus, but how do you get stuff where it needs to go, which we would then collect through adjudicator collection, referee collection, after action report to do a largely qualitative analysis of the narrative and the content, and then presented in a follow-on report. I feel like I did want to add an ethics statement here because I am dual hatting as both a professor or adjunct professor at Colorado State University and president of Liminal Operations. I take it so seriously to the point of paranoia. So I do have a conflict of interest filed with Colorado State saying this is on behalf of social scientific research, not profit. And we all take this very, very seriously. With that, I do have some references here. And you might say, these are some, well, here's my hero, Peter Perla, John Curry. It's like the greatest hits. Say, you have some religious works here. That goes into the psychology of what makes games work. How do you create a ritual of the game so when players are immersed, they embody the player inside the game and actually learn something. And barring that, here's my contact info. And following up what everyone else said, we would love to work with anybody working similar projects and get on board and collaborate in some way. And please don't hesitate to reach out to contact myself or Jennifer or anyone else on my team. Thank you. That is all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thanks so much to all the presentations. I think it's very, very interesting. And I want to make sure there's plenty of time here for people to talk in the little bit we have left. So I'm going to go to one of the questions that I saw Ivanka posted in the chat screen. And it was one that I had myself, which I think in some sense could be applied to everybody. But I think Benjamin's study here in particular stands out as wondering, you know, because it gets to one of the things that Rex said at the start of today's proceedings, which is, what is it about the existing models that you feel like is not sufficient, right? I mean, in your own presentation, you used projections from existing models about what's expected to occur in the future. So I'd be interested to hear you explain a little bit more about what you think the extra is from the matrix game that the existing models can't produce.
Okay, so I think that quantitative models, they cannot cope with the situation because they need to be fed with data related to something that we can compare with the pandemic, and it does not exist. I think that another problem, so the economists, they do a lot of modeling and expectations to see how to assess the situation, but they take a very macro framework. And I think that in everyday life, we mainly face, and I think that economic actors, they mainly face micro decisions. Just let me give you two examples. So just think about the big numbers, a flood of money, and they think that if they put a flood of money, it will be okay. So we have a problem with the social acceptance of the policy implemented by the governments, because economists do consider that if you tell someone jump off the cliff, the people will jump off the cliff. But in France, there is already a lot of social contestation related to what is done by the government. I think that the economic model don't investigate in the actual pandemic the collaboration between the private actors and the public actors. We have a problem these days in France between the public hospitals and the private hospitals, because this is almost a joke. The people working in public hospitals, they think that they are the best to manage the pandemic, and they don't want to work with the people. So they don't say that they don't want to work, but in reality, they don't work with the private actors. And I think that matrix games are well suited to assess and to organize cooperation between public and private actors. And just another example because I underline the importance of private response, and I think that matrix games can investigate this thing. Just another example, road transportation of food product in France. The government has decided, for sanitary reason, the closing of a motorway area. So it was impossible for the truck driver to take a shower or to eat a hot meal, okay? But this is something very important in the situation. And the private actors, so citizens, have created in France Facebook groups in order to mitigate the situation and to propose solutions for the drivers. So I think that economic model, they have a macro approach, and I think that matrix games can investigate the micro problems we face in everyday life, even from an economic standpoint.
Okay, all right, thank you. The question here for Denis from Peter Perler. What contribution can be made to future decision-making by comparing your gameplay during the event to the actual evolution of the responses after the event?
Thank you. I was actually just typing up the answer to this, so I have a good preparation for it. So yes, actually, that is one of the things that there is simply no way for us to design, execute, and communicate the findings of the simulation in time to have any impact whatsoever on the current crisis. So that is unfortunately not even in the cards. But what we are hoping to test and find and see is indeed those dynamics that we would look at how actually things have developed in the early stages when the first cases were reported. What were the first government communications? What were their first responses to, let's say, Italian requests for help? And we will see how, let's say, players have also been reacting in this simulation, try to compare that, possibly extrapolate. One of the things that we were hoping is in the methodology section, Professor Brynan has been referring to the N1 problem, where essentially you have just a single game. So one of the reasons why we are running it over a 3-day course is so that it would be to put in an element of recurring game, so that people have the time to develop some sort of, even if very bare minimum, relationships and see the results of their own actions. And just as it happens in real life, and hopefully then some of those findings could maybe help at least a little bit with the planning or further research, or at least exploratory questions to deal with further crisis or the next phase of this crisis. Because once the initial response passes and we get over the first curve, I've seen some papers that are suggesting that there could be more of them, but I'm not an epidemiologist to comment on that. So hopefully it would have at least a minimum impact of some sort on that by then. But thank you very much for the question.
Okay. I have some more questions here. I want to encourage everyone who's attending to feel free to put questions into the chat or raise their hand to make sure that the panelists receive them. But I have a question here that I think can apply to all of everyone here. So I'm curious to hear everyone's answer to this. And it's motivated a little bit by thinking about the distinction between Benjamin's proposed game and Danis's one, which is all of you guys seem to be proposing some version of a matrix game where we leave it somewhat open, the rules somewhat open, so that we can sort of see naturally how sort of decisions evolve and so on and so forth. But it seems very important that the whole COVID-19 event is an all of society event. It's happening internationally, domestically, it's all sorts of actors are being involved. And so I'm curious to understand the methodological choice for why you select the actors that you do or do not select. So in Benjamin's model, for example, it's very consciously a mix of private and public actors, where in Dana's model, it's very much states and then state-supported IGOs, for example. And so, it seems to me there's private industry, organized crime, domestic political movements that may have trans-border links. We think about international populism, which has been rising obviously over the last 10 years. So I'm curious to know what's the methodological foundation here for choosing the different kinds of actors that you have populating your games. And I think, James, if you want to take that first, because you haven't had an opportunity to answer a question yet, and then the other two.
Right. So honestly, I went for the state in this case. Let me back up. For the course, is it because I wanted to measure students' understanding of how states responded to a crisis. And then for this model, got me thinking that, we have our, healthcare networks, we have our logistics networks, we do have a variety of non-government organizations as well, but who are right now in the crisis, who are we looking at? We're looking at who officially is responding. How in Colorado, how is the governor responding to the crisis? In the United States, how is President Trump responding to the crisis? And whether a country succeeds or fails has largely rested on the shoulders of that leader. So it seemed to me the more initially theoretically interesting from a leadership model to look at the state first. However, again, since it can be an infinite number of scenarios with an infinite number of hypotheses, I can very easily see the value of doing no, let's not do a government leader, let's do a medical team network. Like, how are they, the leader of this hospital and the leader of this healthcare network, are trying to get resources back in across to each other. My only concern would be when it comes to crafting a nice, parsimonious, easy to deploy game. I don't want to mix too many types of players if I don't have to, just so I can make it, again, I can set it in front of players. They go, yes, I can understand what I'm supposed to do, and start gaming.
Okay. Benjamin, if you'd like to respond to the same question.
Yes. So I must be very honest with you. I think that in social science, we all have a kind of political point of view. So as you have mentioned, I'm very focused on private actors because I'm part of what we can call the Austrian School of Economics. So a school which is close to the libertarian movement. So I must be honest. And so this is the reason why I'm so focused on private on private actors. I'm also focused on the firms, the banks, but also citizens, because when you decide to implement, even if you consider public policies, what is said by economics is that if the people they don't believe in, they don't in the policy you're implementing, it won't work. So this is important also to assess the credibility, but credibility is something you cannot measure with a number. You need to have a very fine assessment of the credibility. And this is the reason why in the actors of my matrix games, I expect to put the media also, because they are between the governments and between the citizen, okay? They are they fill the gap in terms of communication, and I think that they play a central role in also the efficiency of public policy. And finally, I have also expected to put, so I have written the United Nations in my slides, so it means all the international institutions because the government, they don't decide everything. And that I think that is a game. Once in Europe, Italians have decided to have the lockdown, all the countries then have followed. And even you in Great Britain, at the very beginning, Boris Johnson said, no, there will be no lockdown, but you now have a lockdown. And I think that there is a kind of mimetic behavior also of the governments. And it relates also to international institutions.
Okay. Dennis?
If we are still answering the question regarding the methodological choice of actors for the simulation, we have actually been toying with the idea of including subnational actors into the mix. In particular, for example, even international crime syndicates. That's a very interesting option. At the moment, I believe it was last week that in the favelas in Brazil, it was actually crime syndicates that have started enforcing social distancing because Brazilian government was unwilling to do that due to political reasons. So you very clearly see how criminal syndicates can play a role in health protection, which is something I wouldn't have bet my money on previously. But in terms of game design, it does seem that state in this case, or national or supranational actors, they're the easiest to make assumptions as to the limitations of their action and to the limitations of their motivation. Whereas more, let's say, private actors or sub-state actors, they're much more volatile. And that's why comparison in that case is much harder. Also, states actually wield very real power in terms of enforcing policies, even the small ones. And because of that reason, it gives us, obviously, as any model, it is incorrect, it is oversimplified, but it gives us a good basis to at least start exploring coordination dynamics. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think I think these are interesting points, and the only reason I mention them is just thinking is that I think what it does is that anything that isn't explicitly modeled as an actor, it strikes me then that they move into the white cell, and so you need to have a clear sense of how you expect them to behaving, the assumptions that's motivating their behavior inside that white cell, and explaining that, and there's a danger here, I suspect, or I suppose, or concerned about that there could be a lot of activity that's taking place that is essentially being run by the adjudicator. And being taken out of the game state because we're assuming that these other actors are going to behave particular ways. Also, to Benjamin's point, there's an interesting comment here in the chat thread by Kathleen Ruiz about, you know, the degree to which many states or leaders are using the situation right now to invoke executive powers and to seize control over certain dimensions of politics, including, for example, the media, right? So the Hungary law that just passed has made it illegal to spread fake news. You know, I think these are the kinds of things that could be interesting to consider, the interaction between these things and how, in fact, even actors can be disappeared by their relationships. You know, media that ceases to be a free media, then it actually becomes part of some other actor, essentially. Okay, I think, are there any other questions that people have from the main area? I think we're probably running over time, so we should probably finish up here if there are not. Okay, well, it's just for me to say thank you very much for all three presentations. They sound like very interesting projects. I encourage everyone who's attending to keep a track on the chat log, because I know that a lot of people here are sharing information about how to get involved in these games and so on and so forth. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll get started on panel number 4. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that audible? Could somebody confirm? That would be great. Hi there, fantastic. By way of introduction, I'm Dr. Aggie Hurst, a lecturer in International Relations Theory and Methods in the Department of War Studies at King's College. Although, of course, like all of us, currently ensconced at home, battling down the hatches and trying to muddle through in the new environment. I'm delighted to be chairing this panel exploring the social effects of the COVID-19 phenomenon. We have two fantastic speakers. We will hear first from Madeline Johnson, who is a senior policy analyst at the Global Affairs Canada Foreign Policy Research and Foresight Division, and she will be talking about gender, vulnerability and COVID-19. Thereafter, we will hear from Paul Howarth, who is a games designer from Story Living Games, from whom we heard briefly earlier as well. He'll be discussing the topic of caring for the community in the current context. Without further ado, I will hand over to Madeline. You have about 15 minutes.
Thanks, Aggie. I'm just going to do the screen sharing, if I can now. And now it's not coming up. Can you remind me where my link is to share the screen?
It should be in the center at the bottom. You should have a box with a green arrow in it saying share screen.
There it is. I'm looking in the wrong spot. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, I have that loud and clear.
Okay, super. Well, thanks, and many thanks to the King's Wargaming Network for hosting this workshop and for inviting Global Affairs Canada to present. My presentation today is going to discuss gender issues in a pandemic and the role of strategic games to examine them. And just a quick introduction of me. My background, academic background, is in international studies and health, but I wouldn't call myself a health expert at all. For the last 10 years, I've been part of the Foreign Service at Global Affairs Canada, and for the last 3 years, I've been in the Foreign Policy Research and Foresight Division. Now I'm going to try and make my... There we go. In March 2019, so just over a year ago, the Foreign Policy Research and Foresight Division at GAC organized and ran a matrix game that modeled a pandemic that started in a fictional China and spread across a fictional globe. And I think all of us involved in the project have found it a bit surreal to now see our design almost come to life. So for the presentation, I'll start with some context and then move into discussion of the game that we ran last year. Before I go too far, I want to acknowledge my colleagues and partners in this project. It really has been a group effort from the start, and something that we've learned with the tool of games. Just like playing, when it comes to organizing and design, we really need to use our networks and work together. So enormous thanks to Drs. Ben Taylor and Murray Dixon from Defence Research and Development Canada, who have been instrumental as gaming experts, and for guiding us at GAC as we build our own skills. We're still quite new to this tool. Dr. Julia Smith is from Simon Fraser University, and Nathan Sears, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and who's also with us at GAC for this year. They've been our indispensable subject matter experts. And I'm also very grateful to my management for their shared enthusiasm on this project. That's Anna Bretzlaff and Denis Robert. So just a bit of context, strategic games are what we're calling war games for foreign policy. And in the world of international relations, we're often forced into reactive decisions. So we can't always anticipate what's going to show up from day to day. And the things that influence decisions include sometimes conflicting perspectives on the causes and consequences of problems, and even disputes of what's a true fact or accepted knowledge. Additionally, more technical elements like budgets, personal careers, election implications are real considerations for decisions that get made. So we all know that neat, rational, evidence-based decisions that are fully based on evidence are pretty unrealistic. And at the best, we can say that our decisions are evidence-informed. So strategic games are not meant to be standalone events that would tell a client everything they need to know about an issue. They're one tool among many for foreign policy research and analysis. And we don't expect games would replace these tools. They're just actually an excellent complement to them. And in particular, we see games as an opportunity to design simplified models of real or potentially real situations with significant flexibility in terms of the types of issues and questions that we can model and that are relevant to foreign policy. And some of these purposes have been mentioned in previous presentations. We've got a good long list here, and I don't want to go too in-depth into that list, but the purposes that we've got here really connect to the fact that in the field of international relations, we have no natural laboratory to test out our policy decisions. So in that sense, strategic games in which bad decisions have no real world consequences offer a needed safe space to examine foreign policy issues, actors, and relationships. And I want to very briefly touch on the Government of Canada's orientation to gender-based analysis plus. So this is an approach that's meant to help us recognize and move beyond our assumptions, uncover the realities of people's lives, and find ways to address their needs when crafting policy. So a GBA plus approach is meant to uncover how different groups might be differently affected by a policy decision, and they prod us to ask some key questions that require a lot of critical self-reflection. So the questions are, do I believe that the issues I work on are gender neutral or culturally neutral or ability neutral? And is this based solely on my own experience? Another question, is it possible that my assumptions prevent me from asking questions and hearing or understanding answers that are outside of my own experience? And finally, how might attitudes and norms, my own, those of my organization, and those of the institutions and society that surround me, limit the range of policy options I consider and propose? So this was an element that we brought into the game and that we asked people to consider when they were thinking about actions. And then as a last bit of background, it's important to have some understanding of the substantive issue that we sought to explore with our pandemic game. And I want to acknowledge here the significant work by Dr. Julia Smith on this topic. So our knowledge and awareness of the tyranny of the urgent phenomenon comes directly from her. And we understand that her work is being recognized by others as well, particularly in the current situation. So this phenomenon recognizes that disease outbreaks have gendered implications, and that these dimensions are both physically and socially constructed. Probably one of the biggest ones may be that women are predominantly carers, both at home and professionally, which speaks a lot to risks for women. During a disease outbreak, women's health needs are often set aside, especially sexual and reproductive health, maternal health. And so this produces the phenomenon known as tyranny of the urgent, in where we have biomedical needs that are sort of considered to be gender neutral. They come in front, and then structural issues are seen as sort of a nice to have, but not a need to have when we think about what the responses should be. And so the idea of a gender analysis within preparedness and responses is often lacking at those stages. It might come after the fact. And where we might see a good example of that was during the Zika crisis, where the advice given to women was to just not get pregnant. And the assumption behind that is that that is 100% in the control of a woman, which is not always the case. And we've noticed that within the current response to COVID-19, we've seen a call to action to address gender implications. So it's potentially that this tyranny of the urgent, there may be a bit of change, but it's still to be seen. So to give you a bit of background about the Matrix game that we ran, we chose to run this game for a few reasons. And I'm glad I have this slide because this was one of the questions that was just asked in the previous panel. So this game was the expansion of a pilot game that had been run in 2017, on which we worked very closely with Rex Brynan, who gave the first presentation today, and who I think is really probably the font of the current expansion of this type of gaming in Canada. And so Rex, we love you, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing. So for the second round of this game, we were looking at being more hands-on and seeing what we could do on our own. And I'm using air quotes to say on our own, because we definitely needed the gaming expertise of our colleagues from DRDC, as well as our subject matter experts. So the crisis scenario met the needs of everyone involved. So our subject matter experts, Julia Smith and Nathan Sears, they were both winners of a separate research competition that our division runs, and both had written about pandemics in that competition. It was also a scenario that suited our defense colleagues and provided good context to design a game, which was what my division was looking for. Additionally, gender issues were, and they still are, timely because of structural inequalities, but also because the political climate was favorable. So it suited us to focus on that. And at the same time, we were also early into thinking about capturing our work as data and representing it that way within a report. And this prodded us into getting ethics approval to record and capture participant experiences in a way that could be written up for academic purposes later. And we also did that. Additionally, it sparked our understanding of the need to layer in an analysis plan as part of the design for any game that we run. Now here's just a bit of the description of the game. So everything was fictionalized, abstracted out so that people wouldn't get bogged down with real world details. So I have a map that I can show you on the next slide. We had a mix of actors that sort of represented government groups, national government groups. We had a UN-like organization, an NGO-like organization, and then private sector medical foundation. The game itself, the first turn was taken up with a preparedness conference in which we asked players to develop some kind of gender considerations. And then the following round started about 10 years after that conference, and each round after that was just the unfolding pandemic. We used news injects, and I have a slide to show you on that too, what those looked like, to sort of keep players up to date with what was happening in the crisis and provide a backdrop to whatever actions they were to propose. So within the game, the progress of events and relationships mirrored the real world closely, including tugs of war over funding, tensions between regions relating to perspectives and access to resources. That real world tyranny of the urgent phenomenon was reflected by an absence of GBA plus considerations for much of the game, despite our explicit indications that we wanted players to engage on this issue. So about halfway through the game, we pushed them into making these arguments by adding an evaluation by our subject matter experts to the minimum dice roll needed for an argument to succeed. In terms of outcomes, luckily for our fictional world, a vaccine was found, but its distribution was limited by struggles over territoriality, patent rights, and the capacity to scale up. Additionally, the focus of actions was on developing a vaccine and not on any mitigating or containment efforts. And so we think that some of this outcome was a result of the limited technical knowledge of the participants, but also potentially by the limits within a matrix game that we allowed to only have one argument per round. Because we were looking at this game as a bit of a test pilot for the tool, we weren't super focused on making sure that we only had subject matter experts as players. And so, you know, if we run this again, that may change what the arguments look like. So here's what our world looked like. So it was a map of Pangea. We used real city names and place them approximately where they might be. And this sort of helped provide players with some familiar anchor points. So it was abstracted, but not too far. And then this is what a news inject slide looked like. I think this one was for about round 3 or round 4. And these little squares, you can find them online where you can break your own news. So you can create your own headlines and use them in this way. On the right side, you can see we use faux tweets to speak to the gender issues. And then I've just got some responses here from what participants thought of the game. So in addition to the debrief, we asked participants to complete a survey a few days after the game. So the game ran on a Friday. We had them do the survey. We sent out the survey on a Monday. So this allowed for that experience to marinate a little bit, but not so long that they had really mentally moved on from the game. We included both closed-ended and open-ended questions, and the responses indicated that they found the game useful as a tool. And what I've got here are just a snapshot of some of the open-ended questions and their responses. I don't want to read them just because I know everybody can read, and I don't want to take up too much time. But I'll go to the next slide, which this question was about GBA+. I actually have 2 quotes here, and I will read the second one. There just wasn't enough space on the slide to provide it. So the first person really recognized that the issues affected men and women differently. And then the second person's response said, I think the fact that you had a gender equality specialist providing advice throughout the game about GBA plus implications of a pandemic was very valuable. In a real global health and security crisis, we need to turn to true experts for advice and help in developing policy positions and not expect expert generalists, desk officers, and management to have that depth of knowledge. So that was a year ago, and we are hoping that these lessons are maybe still sticking with the participants who are engaged on this issue now. So the key takeaways that we got from doing this, we have some that were some more technical ones around game management, but in terms of the using a pandemic, we recognize that that phenomenon, tyranny of the urgent, is really a default for many of us. We want to know how we're going to affect the spread of this disease. However, it can also just be a backdrop and provide many opportunities to look at different dimensions. And I think I've heard in some of the presentations today, some of the ideas that are out there as well, besides just ours. We did recognize that applying a GBA plus framework is something that takes practice. So even if people are using it here and there in their regular work, which is what we are prodded to do as public servants, but it's something that that needs to be we need to recognize that it's not going to be perfect. In terms of games, and we're still new with using games at Global Affairs. So they're powerful tools, but we need to manage them and steer them well to get the most out of them. And that's been, a lot of that messaging has come out of other presentations today too. Rex's at the beginning, of course, for sure. As we recognize that as novices, we really need support to be able to make this happen. So we need both the gaming side of support, and we also need the subject matter expertise. We recognize that games have lots of moving parts, and we need to be well aware of what they are, and we need to keep an eye on all of them. As designers, as very new designers, we're recognizing that these benefits come to us too. And so this comes from Feynman's idea of knowing something by creating it. And then also being a little bit flexible, I think, with some rules is useful for us. So for example, in our game, we only allowed one action per turn, but perhaps in this case, it might be a good idea to maybe allow one crisis intervention idea and maybe one GBA plus idea to allow participants to have that flexibility. And that's sort of the end of mine. I've got a bibliography slide here. There's a link, particularly the last one on GBA Plus, if people are interested in getting more information about that. But most of this is coming from the work of Julia Smith and her colleagues as well. And that's all I have. So I think we're just moving on to the next participant or the next presenter, and then we'll take Q&A after.
Yeah, absolutely. Madeline, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. It's so important to be mainstreaming a gendered lens as this crisis unfolds. And I think your research and your activities there really do show us that we still do have a significant mountain to climb in terms of making sure that we don't default back to a kind of gender blind series of responses, which always have kind of regressive and uneven consequences. So thank you so much for that. I will now turn over to Paul, who is going to discuss broader questions of caring for the community in this context. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Aggie. Actually, it's quite appropriate following on from Madeline because, well, sadly, my human security advisor course next month was cancelled. But I'm a member of 77 Brigade, and in the outreach group, human security is one of our aspects within the group that we are trying to build into a lot of the training that we work on. Let's have a go sharing the screen. Is that it? Are we there?
Yes, that's loud and clear. Brilliant. Thank you.
Right. First of all, I'm going to apologise because I changed the title slightly, because between submission on Wednesday, my thoughts went through a lot of change with some of the work I was involved in. So I brought in the words civil society as a whole rather than just a smaller community. It is something in 77 Brigade that we're really encouraged to start considering because a lot of our work is in other countries, and some of the conversations I had with people last week were around the fact that we need to make sure that how we perceive this particular crisis will not be the way that people in other countries perceive it. And our expectations of what the government might manage, what healthcare might do for us, are often very different to other countries. And therefore, when we're starting to look at best practice elsewhere, we need to bear that in mind as well. So I'll move on quickly. So what we've seen so far, we've seen social media, so I can get that one out of the way. Social media to share activities and support, which I think has been fantastic. People have seen the groups on Facebook. There's about 3 for my village alone. We've seen the naming of shaming of people who've actually been busy stockpiling and hoarding and things like that. And I think Rex made the point around, you don't need a game to teach people about this, although I have seen there is already on eBay a board game about stockpiling toilet roll with a humorous slant to it. So they're already trying to mock it and maybe make people feel ridiculous rather than making them feel bad, which I think is probably more likely to achieve its effect. I think a lot of people do feel a need to do something right now, and these locality groups are an expression of that. We've seen the expressions of national solidarity and support. So, for instance, for those people in the UK, what day are we on now? I'm losing track. The 7 o'clock clapping for the NHS. People on their doorsteps. You could hear it certainly across my village. Lots of people commenting on it, and it's that spirit of community and national solidarity. We're all in this together, which I think was a big change, certainly from maybe a week before when people were highlighting empty supermarket shelves and things like that. So there's already, I think, been a bit of a change, and this is what's starting to inform some of my thinking. I think people are starting to realise what is out there and around them, and it's also highlighted some issues to consider. It also brought us 750,000 volunteers for the NHS in the space of about a week, which has been obviously massively helped by things like social media and things like that. And when I got the email last night, what I was going to talk about, I suddenly changed my mind. And I started thinking, when was the last time we had something like this? And it probably was the call for the local defence volunteers when they had 250,000 men sign up in the space of a week. By 2 months in, I think they had 1.5 million men had signed up for local defence volunteers, which is great that we've got all these volunteers, but it creates its own set of issues. And really, in terms of our proposal now, it's thinking, it's great that there are all these public expressions of wanting to be involved in things. How do we actually possibly, not convinced it necessarily needs a game, but possibly using gaming to actually look at how do we make this more sustainable, and how do we use it to improve our social cohesion, and how do we demonstrate that we can improve our resilience, because I think we were not for six in the early days of this. So some volunteering stats that I brought up when I did a quick dig into this one. 25 to 34-year-olds are a key cohort, I think. I think if you're looking younger, you've got people who are often usually studying, working at the same time, lots of other issues to be dealing with, maybe not the best people to be targeting. But I think it's sort of highlighted, and this is just an anecdotal one, but noticing that charity shops shutting almost immediately because the charity shops are generally run by pensioners, and suddenly they're having to stay indoors. And when lockdown is eased, they're still supposed to be shielded for several more months after that. So how do we actually start thinking about succession planning and building capacity? So just some key stats there. Just a difference there between, sorry, is that an echo? So just a difference, the purple is once a year, blue is the sort of more regular volunteering. And I think what came out of it by employment was the fact, just move that one there, you can see that people in employment are more likely than the unemployed to actually volunteer at this point in time. So that old adage about if you want something doing, ask a busy person, might actually hold true at the moment. So my question is, in terms of the volunteering and looking at trying to strengthen civil society, I think we're in a situation where the lack of investment in local authorities in the UK certainly is apparent in terms of their ability to really try and coordinate these things. They're being swamped by all the things that are going out there. It's great that there's local activity taking place, but there's a lot of duplication, it's patchwork, and people, importantly, will fall through the cracks. So I think we need to look at the demographics of people involved in volunteering and start thinking about strategies for maintaining that goodwill, and also look at that motivation. I did have some entirely unscientific conversations with people in the 18 to 24 category recently, last night when I got the email, and a lot of their feedback was, actually, I do these things because it's the right thing to do. If something needs sorting, then I want to help, and paying me money, giving me incentives isn't really going to be the key thing. But I think as a consequence of all this, as we go through it, there will be more people who've actually felt that intrinsic sense of goodwill, and be more engaged in that process. So how do we then start moving into looking at the retention of volunteers? I think, I'm not going to say it's too late, but because we're already in this process, but we need to start thinking now about how we actually recruit people, how we manage that process. And even as we're recruiting people and sending out calls for them, are we also thinking about, well, how we're going to support them, how we're going to train them? Yes, some of them ideally will keep in this process, but actually also how do we disperse volunteers and actually flag up some of these issues? So when the crisis is over, when, as I said, there probably will be a new normal, some people will have been involved in some quite stressful situations. They might have had a little bit of training in how to do something. They might have just got on with it and done it, but actually the how do they manage that process from being really valued, from maybe being in some really stressful situations, and how do we support those people when they go back into the community? And then sort of going on from that one, this contingency and succession planning. So a lot of community groups, a lot of food banks in this country, organised by older people. If we're not careful, these will fall over again. And I think it's a lesson, and I think we can start to think about, in the right arenas, how do we get that perspective? How do we actually shift the demographic? Not saying sideline the older people, but how to make, because the next pandemic might not just affect older people, could affect everyone, in which case it's a different kettle of fish. But I think there is a skew towards our volunteering at the minute, and I'd like us through game to try and start some of those conversations and bring in different stakeholders. I did stick up there compassion fatigue as well. I think people are very enthusiastic at the minute based on social media posts. First week of homeschooling for lots of people. Oh, sorry, right. So I will quickly move on to these here. Sorry, okay. So in terms of the proposal, looking for broad stakeholder engagement, opportunities to draw out some existing perspectives from people actually involved in it, looking for best practice elsewhere, but bear in mind their perspective on this might be very different based on their context. The game format, I did put Matrix game in there originally. I think it has the possibility that it can be run remotely. I've recently run some play by email Machiavelli, which is quite good fun. And I think that would be a way to, people have got time on their hands, people can answer surveys, people can give their feedback. It's a way for people to contribute. So I would look at remote things there. And the key questions down there, the role of the voluntary sector, how it's been impacted by CV-19, and is this likely to continue? Because we talked about the new normal. And how can we utilise this public goodwill to the best effect? If we can improve social cohesion day to day, that would be fantastic. If more people get involved. But I think next time this happens, and I'm sure there will be a next time, we need to have a more coordinated and more cohesive response. Okay, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Two very thought-provoking and I think very timely reminders that this is not simply a kind of strategic or state-level phenomenon, but actually things that are socially, politically, and internationally located in those ways. We've had a few questions through via the chat feature, so I will put those now to our panelists, and then I will invite them to respond. So Nathaniel Pendleton, excuse me, asks, I think presumably to Madeline, how were the gender differences, priorities and responses simulated on such a strategic scale? And were assumptions made that those needs were the same in each geography, irrespective of cultural differences which may exist? I'll read out the other questions first of all, and just give you a second to reflect on that. We have just a comment from Peter Perler just saying that the fact that so many volunteers normally seem to come from vulnerable older populations raises some interesting challenges here, which I think is exactly right, and I think Paul did comment upon. And then Mark Flanagan asks the following. What back office systems do you think you would need for the volunteers to be ingested into a usual form? This is a loaded question as he comes from the organisation NHSBSA that has to stand up new systems or modify old ones. And then we have just one or two more that I'll quickly read out. There's a comment about Chinese students saying that playing games while in lockdown has been very helpful. Interesting to think about that particular demographic. And then another question directed at Madeline, which is the following. Which, in your opinion, of the existing government responses to the spike in domestic violence reporting are the best practices to assist victims in this situation? So I will turn over first to Madeline to respond and then over to Paul subsequently. Madeline, are you able to respond to some of those questions?
She's on mute.
Ooh. Hi, Madeline, do go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of the first question on how we modeled, I made my internet connection. Okay, sorry. I'm getting periodic messages that's telling me my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully I can respond before things cut off. in terms of the response on how we simulated gender differences, we actually didn't. And that was kind of the beauty of the matrix game model. We put it on the participants to come up with those responses. What would happen if we asked them to do it? And it was, the pandemic was, it was the background, but there was that dynamic, the tyranny of the urgent was involved. And so participants ended up mostly focusing their responses on how they might affect the outcome of the disease outbreak, and not much in terms of concerns. And we think that that was a combination of the expertise among the players themselves and so I think for other games, we would definitely bring in subject matter experts if we wanted to model or look at particular gender. We didn't in this. Ours was just asking the players themselves to come up with those arguments. And for the response workout, I would say that they played according to their player sheet, their profile that we designed for them. So we had Westland, Southland, and countries, sort of more authoritarian regimes in Eastland, and then Southland that would represent more developing. And they sort of followed that outline as to what they might propose. The other question, sorry, I'm just scrolling down through the chat. Existing government responses. So I don't know that I have any expertise to be able to comment in terms of, again, really needs to be provided by, but I think we are seeing a call to action. So there's an international working group now looking at COVID-19 and gender responses, calling for governments to implement something that would address concerns with one of the ones that I've seen most often is looking at the high risks for domestic violence, particularly in where we all have to confine ourselves. So the fact that that's being recognized, it's being discussed publicly, I think is a positive thing in terms of just being able to address some gender concerns. It's not the only one, but it's there. So again, subject matter expertise, very, very, very important, I think, for these games.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I will just throw a further question from Kathleen Ruiz into the mix, who asks what can be done to help incarcerated populations, and how do we help women in birth during the pandemic? So obviously lots of different questions about specific demographics and what we as communities can do, both, I guess, as wargamers, but also otherwise, what can be done here. Paul, I'll open up the floor to you then.
To be honest, I was just looking through, and it was the systems for coordinating volunteers and bringing them online. To be honest, I've not really got that far at this stage, because pretty much thinking last night on this one. But I think there are issues around things like GDPR is a big factor. I think if you start compiling a database of people who consider themselves to be vulnerable, there are all sorts of issues with that, and it's all very subjective. And it's also whether people are happy signing up for something that is government, or whether people are signing up for something that helps their local community. So I'm still at this stage, and that's why I'd quite like some sort of a game to bring in these perspectives. I do think, and I didn't actually finish it on the slide, but I put in there around people constantly talk about pressing the pause button and then unpausing as though we'll carry on. And I think actually this is a really good time to actually take a step back and say, do we actually seeing it as a positive that it's a new normal? It's almost we're having to compromise the new normal. And I think we could try and demonstrate that this could be a way to do things in a better way rather than just in a different way. So for the volunteers, from that perspective, as I say, systems, I have no idea. I think it's really getting their perspective around what they want from it, and then working with other stakeholders like local authorities. And to be honest, when you look at third sector, particularly charities, there are hundreds of thousands of them in this country, and there are lots of vested interest. There's a lot of money in there as well. How you actually try and coordinate that, to be honest, it's a massive, massive can do. open at this point in time. And really, I'm quite interested in individual perspectives at this point before we start going forward to look at wider policy issues. It might be able to use informed policy, but I think it's a whole huge thing at that point in time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've just seen, we're almost out of time, but we've had one final follow-up question from Andrew Kirkpatrick, directed at you, Paul, asking, would you consider gaming the impact of fatalities on volunteers and the role of social media and wider news?
Well, yeah, because I think that's a concern for lots of people. I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, we have lots of university students who currently aren't in, and we could mobilise them. They're less... they seem to be more resilient, more resistant to this particular virus. Brilliant. We can get them all signed up, and then a week later, there are 2 teenagers dying as a consequence of it with no underlying conditions. And then there are all sorts of issues around parents getting involved as well. So I think these things have to be discussed and have a conversation around it. People have to go in. There's a lot of well. I think we need people to be able to make informed decisions, and that's the role that we can play.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We must wrap up. I mean, my 2 cents worth, I suppose, in this kind of conversation is just to maybe think through how we could go about constructing games, exploratory games, which actually allow us to do some evaluation about what we might want this new normal to look like, what we do want to kind of carry forward and get back to in terms of the old status quo, but actually what kinds of opportunities are there here for a, you know, if we do, for instance, have a cultural shift surrounding volunteering and social engagement, you know, how might that be taken forward as something to preserve rather than something to jettison as soon as things go back to the old normal, I suppose. Madeline, I'm afraid we are out of time. Do you have anything vital you'd like to quickly add?
No, just thanks for letting us be a part of this. And we're really happy to be able to see so many people here. It's helping us expand our network as well.
Fantastic stuff. Well, my sincere thanks to you both and to everybody listening and taking part for your questions. We will have a brief break now and we'll reconvene here at 20 past, which is in about 7 or 8 minutes time. Many thanks to everybody and all best. Thank you. Okay, everybody, I think we are now at the 20 past the hour, so allow me to welcome you to this final session of the afternoon, titled Domestic Effects. We again have two fantastic speakers for you. First of all, we'll be hearing from Matthew Stevens, who is the Director of Lessons Learned, Simulations and Training. Matthew will be speaking to the title, Simulation Gaming of Intersectionality, Policy and Access to Services in the COVID-19 Pandemic. After Matthew has reflected on his activities, we will be hearing from Anja van der Hulst, who is a senior scientist at the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. Anja will be speaking to the title, Gaming Pandemic's Dilemmas, Popular Response and Perspectives Previously Unforeseen. Something of a tongue twister, but I look forward to hearing what she has to say. So firstly, over to you then, Matthew. Matthew, we can't currently hear you. I believe you're on mute. If you could unmute your microphone.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was
Thank
on
you.
mute on your end, but it was on mine. All right, let's see here. And if I can bring up my presentation. Are you seeing that okay?
Yes, that is visible and clear. Thank you.
Fantastic, great. All right, well, I'd like to start off by saying thank you to everyone involved in this. Ivanka and Anna, everyone at the KCL Wargaming Network for the amazing work that you're doing, and to everyone for taking part in the workshop today, both to speakers and those who are listening in. It takes a lot of people to make an event like this a success. So I hope everyone is safe and healthy today. I'll start off the presentation with a brief introduction about who I am, and we'll go from there. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matthew Stevens. I'm based in Ottawa, Canada, and I'm the founder of a humanitarian training consultancy called Lessons Learned. Our mission is to bring wargaming or simulation gaming into the humanitarian world, and we believe that humanitarian problems tend to be the same sort of complex problems that serious games help with in military and other settings. We have a particular interest in helping to communicate and share perspectives of disaster and conflict-affected people to those that design relief interventions, and that's kind of what we're talking about today. So the question from my organization is the same as it was for all of us. How can we bring, or what can we bring, sorry, to the COVID-19 response? How can we use our particular skill sets to support the response in a useful and productive way? We all want to help out, but as Rex mentioned this morning, how do we do so without getting in the way? So we reached out to our contacts among implementing actors, one of whom was actually Madeline Johnson of Global Affairs Canada, from whom we heard of in the previous session, to see if and where we might be able to produce some useful insight. Now, the answer that came back from all of those that we contacted was universal. Whether we're looking at response internationally or locally, policymakers need to be supported in looking at this crisis from multiple points of view. Now that could be gendered experiences, but also considering age, health, minority status, etc. We should be taking into account power dynamics. So looking at who is experiencing barriers to accessing essential goods and services like medical care, food, or a safe home. And who is being exposed to unequal risk when accessing those goods and services. Now, to me, the academic lingua franca to conceptualize these sorts of questions is the intersectionality framework. So I'll give a very brief introduction to that. Intersectionality is a theory arguing that when analyzing a person's experience of and opportunities in our society, we have to look holistically at gender, economic class, ethnicity, et cetera, at the same time. And we have to look at how these categories interact. So this theory has grown over the years to include many different things: age, different abilities, legal status, sexual orientation, etc. But it's important to understand that this goes beyond some simple labeling. We're looking at how relationships of power play out across society. So who has advantages based on their intersectional identities? Who is disadvantaged? It's the interaction between these advantages and disadvantages that shape what opportunities a person is afforded or denied. Now, because this was an emergency situation, we wanted to look at our existing toolkit to see what we already had ready. Now, we regularly run a simulation called The Day My Life Froze. It's designed to teach humanitarian workers and donors about the social dynamics of urban refugee response. Using military terminology, this would correspond to an operational tactical level exercise. Now, participants in The Day My Life Froze already explore a lot of the same questions we're asking in our own communities right now. Who has access to different opportunities? How is that access controlled? How does it affect a person's livelihood strategy? The simulation game looks at how institutional assumptions about people's needs, wants, values, and behavior do or do not align with how people view themselves, formulate their own goals. So how might we adapt this exercise to the context of COVID-19? The first question for us was how to represent intersectionality in a game. Now, The Day My Life Froze already features a series of households that have different comparative advantages and disadvantages, but that system was not comprehensive enough to come up, or to represent the richness of intersectional analysis. So we're currently working on what we're calling an intersectionality deck, which outlines variegated experiences of COVID-19 in Canadian cities. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a work in progress. But the idea is that participants will be assigned an identity represented by a set of cards, each of which indicates an intersectional social categorization that may provide a benefit or a disadvantage relevant to the crisis. And these might include gender, age, economic class, minority status, health, family structure, etc. We're also, through the same system, hoping to capture different sorts of factors like housing or employment status, what roles people play in the community, such as grocery store workers or delivery people. Although those don't necessarily fit into the intersectionality framework traditionally, they are playing important roles in shaping people's experiences of the disease and of the response. So you'll see here I have a quick mock-up based on my own research and experience, but you'll also note that I've not yet touched some more sensitive subjects. So how do we represent the fact that, for example, domestic abuse cases are spiking and victims of domestic abuse have dramatically reduced access to programs which protect them? Or how does this disease affect how does this disease and the effects of self-isolation impact people of non-binary genders or of different sexual orientations? We're dealing here with some very sensitive subjects, and I'm acutely aware in engaging in this project that I'm a straight white man. So I'm proceeding with caution and reaching out to subject matter experts as we move forward to develop the system. And why all this structure? Why don't we just draft a quick matrix game? Well, I believe anyway that additional constraining mechanics are required when we're attempting to explore points of view which participants may not fully understand. So if the goal here is to impart new insights to policymakers, we should be providing this kind of structure to help illuminate how decisions are made by individuals in the community. Speaking of which, how do people interact with the community? Well, we're looking at what people are in need of: food, shelter, healthcare, education, caring for mental health. Unless there's some other sort of intervention, securing most of these things require money. And how do we get money? Some form of work. As in our other exercises, we're foregrounding quality of life as the key determinant, or as a key determinant of behavior. This plays a major role in shaping real life decisions at the household level. Of course, there are a lot of things we're still working on. So we're still exploring how some of these actions involve exposing oneself to more risk than other actions. Perhaps you can engage in as many actions you like in a round, but for each action, you are exposing yourself to some kind of risk, modeled by a card flip, drawing a token from a bag, something like that. And this risk should be tied to a larger community risk factor, which represents the spread of COVID-19 in the community. And perhaps then that as more actions are taken in the society, this can lead to a higher community risk factor. We're trying to recognize that some player roles actually revolve around important tasks in the community: grocery store workers, delivery people, healthcare workers, etc. And so we'd like to explore the impact on the community when these systems are influenced by illness. So what else are we working on here? Well, challenges we still haven't solved. How do we model the infection spread? Or do we even need to? I mean, maybe that's extraneous to the exercise that we're putting together. How are we going to plot this, or are we going to plot this on a map? Do space and place have a role to play, or is it a simple game board something better? What happens when an agent, which a participant, becomes ill in the exercise? What options are available to them at that point? And how could the scenario translate into global contexts? And then finally, I think it's very, very important, again, to say, well, how do we validate what we're presenting? We don't want to impart the wrong lessons because we made an incorrect assumption. Now, part of the reason why we've let some of these questions linger is that we don't want to build something that doesn't serve a purpose. So if there are any stakeholders in the audience that can see how something along these lines will help achieve a particular goal, fantastic. Let us know and we can shape this in an appropriate direction. But we don't want to run all the way to the finish line without knowing that we're doing something useful. Now, finally, I do want to acknowledge that we are all gaming in the age of COVID-19. The structure of the structure that the original game was built around assumed you had 15 people in a room, bumping into each other, close talking, gripping the same little cards and components in sweaty hands and things like that. Obviously, that's not a reasonable approach today. So what do we need to do? Are we moving online? There are drawbacks to this, but there also might be some benefits as well. Be easier to model the spread of illness. It would be faster to set up and run. And if we can make it a solo experience, maybe we can have repeated runs exploring different people's experiences. Again, the question of policymakers' time means that we want to be putting something together that can happen very, very quickly. Right now, we're experimenting with Unity Engine and HTML5. It's a little bit more complicated, but we'll see if it pays out or if we're just diving too deep. Let you know how it goes. So I wanted to thank again Ivanka and Anna, everybody at KCL Wargaming Network, and to all the participants and listeners today, and looking forward to answering any questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Matthew, before I put any questions to you, we will turn over to Anya, who, as I mentioned previously, is going to be speaking about popular responses and perspectives to previously unforeseen phenomena. So Anya, are you able to hear me and to sign in? I believe your microphone might be muted. Anya, if you can unmute.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can't see you, but if you're planning not to use the camera, that's fine too.
Sorry, again, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, lovely. So I had a different connection, guys. Sorry, I have a double connection now. Right.
I know we can't see you. I don't know if you're planning to use the video or...
No, sorry.
Okay, not to worry.
Okay. Have you got my screen at the moment?
Yes, we've got your screen. That's
oh,
fine.
Lovely, lovely. So sorry about the confusion. So I'm Anja van der Hulst. I work at the Lab for Defense, Safety and Security in the Netherlands. And us being so small, we do a lot, including defense. I chair the wargaming team here in the Netherlands. And I'm going to talk about dilemma gaming that we actually do for quite a while now in the Netherlands. At this moment, all our mayors have been trained for policy decision-making in crisis situation while using the game that you see in the background. Currently, so every mayor that comes in receives initial training for policy decision-making crisis situation on the basis of this dilemma game, and they have repetitive training. with a set of 19 crisis scenario, and it depends on the nature of their city or community, which scenarios they play. It might be flooding, there's a scenario about criminal gangs, there's scenarios about terrorist attacks. So in this game, each scenario contains about 6 to 8 dilemmas with each 4 to 6 perspectives, and I'll show what the perspectives are. And always those teams do a reflection, and we come up with perspectives not previously encountered. Usually that happens a lot. So I have to go back a little bit to our background. We did before 8 years before when we just started this 8 years before, we did a lot of large exercises with regional boards and city boards. However, they didn't work for policy decision making because usually the coordination was so bad that policymakers stopped making policy and they went on to help with coordination. So we decided that we had to separate this. And it's really about the decision making itself and not about the coordination. So taking the work of Gary Klein from 1989 on his work of decision making, that's 20 years of research into decision making. So crisis management, decision making, it's all about high stakes. It's very dynamic and the conditions change continually. It's about uncertainty and ambiguity, very ill-defined time constraints, multiple actors, and of course there are significant personal consequences. And in this COVID crisis, of course, we see a lot of dilemmas where decisions have to be made about. It's about restricting international traffic, closing national borders, restaurants, schools, non-essential businesses, whether you go into full lockdown, but also what are you going to do when I see that demand is higher than capacity? And so beginning of, say, 2 weeks ago, we started building games that we actually could play online. And this is, you don't need to be able to read it, it's actually in Dutch, but this is one of the games we made on the COVID crisis. On the right-hand side, you see a number of indicators. Green is a number of positive events, private companies that provide solutions. Red are negative events. And yellow is what my team of players actually came up with in terms of measures. And in the middle, you see a curve of, in the end, 15 days of future of the corona crisis, and actually the demand for IC capacities exceeding what we have. So to give an example, what we're actually building at the moment. So we played this through, and I've done last week in 3 different sessions. And
Anya, I'm sorry, I'm going to quickly interrupt. I've just had a couple of messages saying that your slides haven't been going through. Can you make sure you hit the slideshow feature to ensure that we can see what you're referring to?
Sorry. Yeah. Oh, crap.
We still have the opening slide where it has your name and the images of the self-services.
I'm pulling play. Is it better?
We still have the same image currently.
Oh, that's okay. I'm actually sorry about this. I'm using my husband's Mac, which I really don't know how to work with.
It says that someone is saying that if you you can just proceed using the key arrows or the enter button. Another suggestion is if you go to slideshow, again, you should be able to use the arrow buttons. If you just go to the, I think it should be in the bottom right area where it says this, or you have slideshow in the middle at the top, the option there, next to animations.
No, it says play only.
And yet at the bottom, you'll see an icon that looks like a projector screen.
Not in this one. It's not PowerPoint. It's not
Oh.
PowerPoint. Let me go back. Just a second. I have a different screen. Oh crap!
We've clicked forward. That looks promising.
Yeah. Is this working for you guys?
Yeah, I can see that loud and clear.
Okay, so this was the game. I'm now looking at different screens. So this was the game that we used, and these were the dilemmas. Okay, so anyone, can you see? Right. So this is our game. So in this dilemma game, you're being presented with a dilemma. You have to make a decision, and there are 4 to 6 advisors that will give their perspective on this dilemma. For instance, it might be medical, it might be economic, foreign affairs, from a sociological point of view or a technical point of view. So they're actually giving their narrative on what you have to do. And some will say, yes, you will have to go, in this case, it was into full lockdown. And some will say, no, absolutely not. So in the end, you end up with a number of yeses and a number of no's. And you will have to forecast how the Dutch population, in this case, will react to what you've actually decided upon. And the thing here is that all these advisors have a lot of different perspectives, and there's actually quite a bit of emotion involved. As we have seen on the television, our medical staff is desperate, and they are kind of interpreting our decision whether or not to go into lockdown. This is the example I'm giving, that we really need to, because people are not complying to the regulations. The economic guy, the economic advisor, actually is telling that people are complying and that there are very good reasons, economic reasons, to keep up what we call limited restriction policy that we are following now. So there's a lot about different narratives, and it's also very much about uncertainty and ambiguity. So the exact effects of what you would decide are really not known. But there are a lot of opinions, and it's very ill-defined. Outcomes cannot be calculated. Part of it is really less rational. To what extent will people be anxious about any decision you're going to make, and this will affect their compliance. So to wrap up here is that we are building this now very rapidly. We are using a kind of very limited matrix game style kind of game. I go back to how it looks like. So this is our matrix game style game that we play online using PowerPoint to very quickly understand the dilemma, see the perspectives, and now we'll start to play at a regional level and a local level, play the dilemmas out and to collect more of the perspectives that are relevant to these issues. We're fully in the progress. So I can't tell a lot about what's coming out, except for that it's working for like 8 years now for different domains. So I'll stop here.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that quick fix of your materials and for a fascinating series of insights into your game. We've got several questions that have come through the chat. What I'll do is prioritize those that are framed specifically as questions rather than relay all the comments, just in the interest of time. So there's one, first of all, for Matthew, which has come through, and it reads as follows. From the perspective of intersectionality, how would you engage with the guidelines many healthcare institutions have disseminated for prioritizing access to care, such as ventilators? that indicate that disabled individuals or those that suffer from chronic illness should be passed over for potentially life-saving treatment in favour of those without these conditions. And there's a second one, if I scroll down, also I think directed. There's a comment here that has popped up as well, just saying that your comment, Matthew, touches upon a few issues in the US that have major public health ramifications, homelessness and prison populations in particular. I'll turn it over to Matthew to respond. If people have some comments or questions for Anya, please put them into the text now so that I may pose them to her.
That's quite a bomb of a question. I saw Peter Perla responded to that saying he's glad he doesn't have to make those sorts of decisions, and I certainly agree. It's pretty far beyond my remit. I would say in the context of a simulation game, to this point, we're not looking at the systems that are taking place inside the hospital, right? We're looking more at what's happening in the community, how people procure food, how people access the hospital. Once you're inside, I think that's a different exercise. Someone else will have to take that on, I suppose. From an intersectional standpoint, yeah, I mean, it's kind of the ultimate application of the theory, isn't it? You know, based on who you are, your age and your health, you very well might be assigned a certain value and might lose right to life. But I mean, at the same time, what is the alternative in the world today? You know, it's a triage question, as some of the conversation has in the chat has said, and it's terrifying, right? It really is. I don't know if I can expand on that anymore, but
yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly encountering a situation where, as difficult as decision making usually is, it seems even more so under the current state of things. So not an enviable position to be in currently. We have a question for Anya, which has come through. It reads, how long would it take to develop this variation for the dilemma game to include other options and impacts? How long does it take to run? And how fast do your stakeholders require outputs?
Okay, to start with the most easy one, we always run in 30 minutes, and that's the big advantage of this kind of game. It's web-based, and they can log in and play 30 minutes. Reflection might take a little bit longer, but we might cut it off at 30. How long will it take to develop these variations of dilemma games? If you're kind of experienced, usually if you have insights in the dilemmas and a bit of the perspective, it usually takes me a week to actually develop a full dilemma game, and then still a bit of testing, but basically quite quick. And how fast do your stakeholders require outputs? In this case, really, really fast, because it's emerging as we go. And at the moment, there's just one part in the Netherlands that has a very severe outbreak, and those city boards and mayors have experiences with hospital systems being overwhelmed, and they need to spread that insights to the rest of the country that is still not heavily affected. So within a week or two, it needs to be done, and everything has to be collected. But we work iteratively. As soon as we get new novel perspectives, we work them into the dilemmas.
Okay, great. And Matthew himself has just followed up to ask, what web system is the dilemma game built on? Is it something that is bespoke in-house, or something that can be accessed by those of us outside?
It is unfortunately built in-house, but we can consider to sort of make it available more broader, at least for this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Does anybody else have any questions or comments that they would like to pose? As I mentioned, there are lots of comments in the discussion box, probably too many for me to read out in their entirety. If anyone would like to contribute, please just do so now. I will take any questions. Peter has just commented that it strikes him that Anya's dilemma game may be a useful framework for combining insights from other games to give decision makers an overview of the challenges they may face. I think certainly a good point there.
So that's basically our approach. So we start exploratory with a very limited form of matrix gaming. What we actually noticed was that if we take people online and try to do matrix games, it takes too long if you really want to go in depth. So we limit the argumentation that is usually, that must be in matrix game, but we just have them discuss their options and just put them into the field in the measures, and we log the argument. So that's exploratory, but then we put the things we found there into the dilemma games. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And just to follow up, again, can the results of the dilemma game be debilitating, or are they enlightening as well?
It is very confrontational usually, but that's probably the case with all games covering these pandemic issues, because you're deciding upon life and death. And well, enlightening, not in a optimistic way, absolutely not. But yeah, it's giving it a lot of insight.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it certainly is a strange set of circumstances to be gaming outside of the realm of the hypothetical. Suddenly these things that are done, you know, to advise or to analyze or in the abstract suddenly are much more directly kind of relevant to real world events in the immediacy than perhaps many of us are used to. So certainly destabilizing on that regard. We're pretty much at time, so I'll just check in with Matthew to see if he has any final comments to make.
No, I don't think so. I mean, there was the one comment about you know, the homeless or prison populations, and I think again that's something that we'd like to try and capture. When I mentioned housing, that's kind of what I was thinking of. I mean, that can run from having a nice big sprawling house that you can all isolate in your own rooms into being in a small apartment, all the way to not having a home, and what does that mean for you in this crisis?
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the questions that often get overlooked. I mean, when Madeline talks about the tyranny of the urgent, yeah, that's definitely an important thing to be studying. So.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think what seemed to have come out for me certainly of this panel and the previous one is the question of, you know, which kinds of lenses are we going to be looking through in order to create adequate responses to this? If we fall back on a gender blind or a kind of assumption of a certain you know, subject position, then we certainly do risk responses which have differential and unequal consequences for various stakeholders. Okay, we are at time. I would very much like again to thank the two fantastic panelists from whom we've just heard. I will hand over now to Ivanka Barzashka again, the director of the Wargaming Network, to close off our discussion for this first day of this Wargaming webinar. Thank you again from me to all participants, and I wish you a very pleasant rest of your day.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you to today's presenters for sharing the findings of past projects and for developing new proposals on such short notice. We're very grateful to Professor Richard Sullivan and Dr. Aggie Hurst and Dr. David Banks, who will be joining the Department of War Studies in the fall, and also to Anna Nettleship, our coordinator, who is behind the scenes keeping us organized. We have an important opportunity and responsibility to use our research expertise in support of national and international responses to the novel coronavirus outbreak, and also to understand the long-term effects that the pandemic could have on a range of sectors. So tomorrow we will return to the question of how wargaming can contribute to these questions, with 4 panels. 2 will be focused on methods, and 2 will be looking at broader security threats, as well as regional cooperation in Southeast Asia. So please join us back at 12:30 British Summer Time, and we'll conclude the day tomorrow with a 1-hour discussion on next steps and what we can do to outthink this problem together. Thank you very much for joining us.